I'm William. I work at Mack Trucks in Macungie, Pennsylvania.
I'm Chamini from Sri Lanka. I'm a teacher of English.
Ich bin der Kevin aus Augsburg in Deutschland.
I'm a registered nurse in California.
Mein Name ist Frank. Ich bin Pflegekraft in Deutschland.
I used to work at Berisha in Saline, Michigan.
Ich bin Harald, ein Lehrer in Deutschland.
I'm attending the May Day rally because we have a lot of problems that we can overcome as an international working class.
We got to fight for the common cause, which is A, getting rid of this COVID, B, stopping this war, and C, getting our working class into the political stream, because we're the ones that's dying, we're the ones that's hungry, we're the ones suffering from the gas prices.
Man geht zur Arbeit, man kommt nach Hause, man hat kein Geld. Spritpreise steigen, Lebensmittelpreise steigen.
All the essential goods and everything is rising up, especially the food.
You see your money just going less far. We're doing more work now for the same amount of money.
People are just really fed up with inflation, with another war, with just letting the virus rip through society and let people die.
This is killing our kids, it's killing our elderly, and it's killing us as a working class, like my brother.
We have to unite together to fight against COVID.
The workers need to be united against COVID, this war.
I mean, nuclear bombs are what we're talking about again. And it's capitalism that drove that threat the first time, and it's doing it again.
It can destroy the whole world at once.
My solidarity is with Russian and Ukrainian workers. Same thing with Sri Lanka workers, workers in Peru and Sudan. Anyone that's a worker in the working class like me, I consider an ally.
I think we should stand behind those workers in Sri Lanka, and we should stand behind the workers in Ukraine and also in Russia. It's a world thing. We need the world workers unite to stop the war. Otherwise, the war is going to stop us.
Es ist wichtiger denn jemals zuvor, dass wir Arbeiter hier gemeinsam für unsere Ziele eintreten.
We need workers' organizations, rank and file committees to take control of what's happening and address the social needs of the working class.
Ich bin für die internationale Einheit der Arbeiterklasse.
It's high time for the workers to get united together for their rights. The working class should rule the whole world.
It's going to be up to us to do something about it.
Welcome to the International May Day online rally organized by the International Committee of the Fourth International, its affiliated Socialist Equality Parties, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, the International Workers' Alliance of Rank and File Committees, and the World Socialist website. My name is Johannes Stern. I'm the editor of the German language edition of the World Socialist website and a member of the Sozialistische Gleichheitspartei, the Socialist Equality Party in Germany, and I will be moderating today's event. We are celebrating the holiday of the international working class under ominous conditions. The war of the US-NATO powers against Russia and Ukraine threatens to expand into a world war, with the most horrific consequences. The Second World War cost the lives of over 70 million people. A Third World War would rapidly escalate into a nuclear cataclysm that would threaten the survival of the entire planet. The COVID-19 pandemic, now in its third year, has already killed some 20 million people. It is the result of the criminal subordination of public health to private profit. While nearly all governments outside of China have abandoned even the most basic measures to contain the virus, it continues to infect and kill, and new variants continue to emerge. All over the world, inflation and economic hardship is leading to demonstrations, protests and strikes. The death agony of capitalism, which is confronting the international working class once again, with mass death, war and historically unprecedented increase in social inequality, has set the stage for revolutionary explosions around the world. The central task is to provide the developing struggles of the working class with its own independent organizations and a clear political perspective and leadership. This is the purpose of today's rally. The great and ever more urgent historical task, as Trotsky put it so powerfully on the eve of World War II, is the resolution of the historical crisis of the leadership of the proletariat. This means the building of the ICFI and the socialist equality parties all over the world as the new mass organizations of the working class. To introduce these issues, the first speaker today will be David North. Comrade North is the chairperson of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website and the national chairperson of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States. He has played a leading role in the international socialist movement for more than 5 decades and is the author of many essential books on history, politics, and Marxist theory. Only to name some of the most important: The Heritage We Defend, The Crisis of American Democracy, In Defense of Leon Trotsky, The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century, The Frankfurt School, Postmodernism and the Politics of the Pseudo-Left, and A Quarter Century of War, the US Drive for Global Hegemony. In the preface of A Quarter Century of War, published in 2016, Comrade North wrote, and I quote, "The last quarter century of US instigated wars must be studied as a chain of interconnected events. The strategic logic of the US drive for global hegemony extends beyond the neo-colonial operations in the Middle East and Africa. The ongoing regional wars are component elements of the rapidly escalating confrontation of the United States with Russia and China. Well, this is now happening, but the spiral towards World War III must be stopped. Clearly, no one is better prepared to explain what this requires than Comrade David North. So let me issue a warm welcome to Comrade North to introduce this rally."
This year's May Day is being held under extraordinary circumstances. The world stands on the precipice of a nuclear war that threatens the extinction of life on this planet. The challenge of May Day 2022 is to make today's celebration of the international unity of the working class the beginning of a global movement of the broad mass of the world's population to stop the criminal and reckless escalation of the NATO-Russia war to a nuclear conflict and to force the war's end. The organization, development, and victory of this movement requires a clear understanding of the causes of the war and the interests that it serves. The International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Party of Socialist Revolution, unequivocally denounces U.S. and European imperialism for instigating the conflict with Russia. This is not a war in defense of democracy in Ukraine or anywhere else in the world. It is a war whose aim is the redivision of the world, that is, a new allocation of the material resources of the globe. Russia has become a target of U.S. imperialism not because of the Putin regime's autocratic character, but because, first, its defense of the national interests of the Russian capitalists collide with the drive of the United States for global hegemony, which is centered on its preparations for war with China. And second, the vast expanse of Russian territory is the source of immensely valuable and strategically critical raw materials, metals and minerals such as gold, platinum, palladium, zinc, bauxite, nickel, mercury, manganese, chromium, uranium, iron ore, cobalt, and iridium, to name only a few, that the United States is determined to bring under its control. The other major imperialist powers allied with the United States are likewise pursuing their own reactionary economic and geostrategic interests. The conflict in Ukraine has provided German imperialism, which waged a war of extermination against the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1945, with the opportunity to undertake the most massive rearmament campaign since the collapse of the Nazi regime. As always, British imperialism is eager to participate in an American-led war, hoping that its so-called special relationship with the United States will entitle it to a favorable distribution of the spoils of war. The French imperialists hope that by sanctioning, however reluctantly, the American war against Russia, the United States will not interfere with French operations in Africa and other parts of the world. Even the lesser powers of the NATO alliance expect to be repaid for their endorsement of the US-led war. Poland, for example, has not forgotten that Lviv was once the Polish city of Lvov. As for the United States' invocation of the sacred right of Ukraine as a sovereign nation to join NATO if it so chooses, Washington does not recognize the extension of that right to any country whose national defense interests are viewed as a threat to America's planet-wide security. Even as the crisis unfolds in Ukraine, the United States is threatening military action to stop the Solomon Islands, 6,000 miles away from the American West Coast, from entering into a defensive relationship with China. The claim that NATO is reacting to an unprovoked invasion of a politically blameless Ukraine by an aggressive Russia intent on restoring the lost Soviet Empire are a pack of lies. An objective study of the background of the war clearly demonstrates that Russia's invasion of February 24th, 2022, was a desperate response to NATO's relentless expansion. As the development of the war over the past 2 months has clearly shown, the United States and NATO, armed and trained Ukrainian forces working closely with the neo-Nazi elements associated with the Azov Battalion to wage a proxy war against Russia. The pretense that NATO's massive mobilization against Russia has been an unforeseen, unplanned, and improvised response to the invasion is a political fairy tale for the politically naive. This is a war that the United States and NATO wanted, gamed out, prepared for, and instigated. Since the initial Orange Revolution of 2005, and especially the Maidan Putsch that was organized by the Obama administration to bring down the pro-Russian Yanukovych government in 2014, the United States has been set on a course for war with Russia. The cynical claim that the U.S. and NATO did not plan for or instigate the war is refuted most powerfully by the repeated warnings made by the International Committee and the World Socialist website. At the first online May Day rally sponsored by the International Committee and the WSWS in 2014, we warned, just a few months after the Maidan Putsch, that, and I quote, the Ukrainian crisis was deliberately instigated by the United States and Germany through the orchestration of a coup in Kiev. The purpose of this coup was to bring to power a regime that would place Ukraine under the direct control of U.S. and German imperialism. The plotters in Washington and Berlin understood that this coup would lead to a confrontation with Russia. Indeed, far from seeking to avoid a confrontation, both Germany and the United States believe that a clash with Russia is required for the realization of their far-reaching geopolitical interests. Exactly 6 years ago today, at the 2016 May Day rally, we warned that the drive of the United States for global hegemony set it on a path toward war with Russia and China. We stated, and I quote again, a substantial section of Pentagon and CIA strategists believe that the strategic isolation of China requires not only American control of the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean regions, the United States must also dominate Eurasia, characterized in the textbooks of international geopolitics as the world island. This is the strategic objective that underlies the growing conflict between the United States and Russia. International relations have reached a level of tension that equals, if it has not already surpassed, what existed in the late 1930s on the eve of World War II. All the major imperialist powers, including Germany and Japan, are increasing their military commitments. That a conflict between the United States, China, and Russia could involve the use of nuclear weapons is already being acknowledged. It would be the greatest of errors to assume that neither the political and military leaders of the imperialist powers nor their frightened adversaries in Beijing and Moscow would ever risk the devastating consequences of nuclear war. 1 year later, at the May Day rally of 2017, we called attention to discussions among U.S. strategists of the feasibility of using nuclear weapons in a future military conflict. We cited various strategies that entailed the use of nuclear weapons, including nuclear use against a non-nuclear opponent, a first strike aimed at eliminating an opponent's capacity to retaliate, threatening to use nuclear weapons to force an opponent to back down, and the launching of a limited nuclear war. We asked, and I quote, "Who are the maniacs who have devised these strategies?" The willingness to consider any of these strategies is in itself a sign of madness. The use of nuclear weapons would have incalculable consequences. Will this fact deter the ruling classes from resorting to war? The entire history of the 20th century, not to mention the experience of just the first 17 years of the 21st, argues against such a hopeful assumption. The political strategy of the working class must be based on reality, not self-deluding hopes. Just one more quote. At the 2019 May Day rally, against the backdrop of mounting political crisis in the United States, we said, and I quote, "The violation of constitutional norms in the conduct of domestic policy and the resort to gangster methods in foreign policy are rooted in the final analysis in the crisis of the capitalist system. The desperate efforts of the United States to maintain its position of global dominance in the face of geopolitical and economic challenges from rivals in Europe and Asia require a state of permanent and escalating war. This reckless policy will prevail with or without Trump. Indeed, the anti-Russia hysteria that has gripped the Democratic Party makes it reasonable to suspect that, were it to regain the White House, the danger of a world war will be even greater." Events have confirmed our warnings. Nothing can stop the unfolding of this terrible logic of imperialist war and its consequences except the revolutionary movement of the working class against capitalism. Now, this perspective underlies not only our denunciation of U.S. NATO imperialism, but also our attitude to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The imperialist character of the war being waged by NATO does not justify, from the standpoint of the interests of the international working class, the decision of the Russian government to invade Ukraine. The International Committee condemns the invasion as politically reactionary. The Putin's government's decision to invade has killed and injured thousands of innocent Ukrainians who are in no way responsible for the policies of the corrupt Kiev government. It has divided the working class in Russia and Ukraine and played into the hands of the imperialist strategists in Washington, D.C. and Langley, Virginia. It has provided German imperialism with the opportunity to massively rearm. The dangers that now confront Russia are, in the final analysis, the consequence of the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 by the Stalinist bureaucracy and the restoration of capitalism. The destruction of the Soviet Union, the outcome of the Stalinist repudiation of the principles of socialist internationalism which guided the 1917 October Revolution, was based on three catastrophically false conceptions that have been fervently embraced by the Soviet bureaucracy. The first was that the restoration of capitalism would result in the rapid enrichment of Russia. The second was that the dissolution of the bureaucratic regime would result in the blossoming of bourgeois democracy. And the third was that capitalist Russia's repudiation of its revolutionary legacy would result in its peaceful integration into a blissful brotherhood of capitalist nations. These delusional expectations have been shattered by reality. The warnings of Leon Trotsky, brilliantly elaborated in his 1936 book, The Revolution Betrayed, have been vindicated. Capitalist restoration has resulted in the impoverishment of large sections of the Russian population, the replacement of the bureaucratic regime with dictatorial oligarchic rule, and the imminent threat of Russia's breakup into semi-colonial statelets controlled by imperialist powers. The fact that the Putin regime could not find another answer to the dangers confronting Russia other than by invading Ukraine and now threatening a nuclear response to NATO's provocations testifies to the political bankruptcy of the regime of capitalist restoration. The Russian capitalist oligarchy, whose wealth is derived from the systematic plundering of the nationalized property relations of the worker state, repudiated all that was progressive in the social and political foundations of the Soviet Union. It is hardly accidental that Putin, in a speech of February 21, 2022, justified the imminent invasion of Ukraine with an explicit and bitter denunciation of the Bolshevik regime's defense of the democratic rights of the nationalities that had been brutally repressed by the Tsarist regime prior to its overthrow in 1917. Putin declared that the Soviet Ukraine was, as he said, the result of the Bolshevik policy and can be rightfully called Vladimir Lenin's Ukraine. He was its creator and architect. Yes, Lenin was the creator of the Soviet Ukraine, and the Bolshevik defense of the rights of the oppressed nationalities, and especially in Ukraine, was a major factor in the victory of the Red Army led by Trotsky in the civil war that followed the October Revolution. Putin was careful to avoid mentioning that the process of bureaucratic degeneration of the Soviet Union found its initial expression in Stalin's efforts to undermine Lenin's defense of the rights of the non-Russian nationalities. These principles had been most eloquently elaborated in a document drafted by Trotsky in March 1920, which specifically addressed the critical issue of Ukraine. While making no concessions to the reactionary bourgeois nationalists, Trotsky, himself a Ukrainian, wrote, "In view of the fact that Ukraine culture has for centuries been suppressed by Tsarism and the exploiting classes of Russia, the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party makes it obligatory for all members of the party to help in every way to remove all obstacles to the free development of the Ukrainian language and culture." End of quote. Putin, a bitter enemy of socialism and the heritage of the October Revolution, is incapable of making any genuinely democratic and progressive appeal to the Ukrainian working class. Instead, he invokes the reactionary legacy of Tsarist and Stalinist great Russian chauvinism. The Fourth International's opposition to Putin's invasion of Ukraine is based on the defense of the principles upheld by Lenin and Trotsky. But the defense of these principles require unrelenting opposition to the reactionary machinations of American and European imperialism. The imminent danger of a nuclear Third World War is the culmination of the global wave of socioeconomic and political reaction and political violence that has followed the dissolution of the Soviet Union. As he walked about the streets of Kiev this past week, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, proclaimed in a despairing tone that war in the 21st century is, he said it was an absurdity. If Mr. Guterres arrived at this philosophical insight only after visiting Ukraine, one must wonder where he has been hiding during the last 22 years. This young century has not known a moment's peace. In fact, the last 30 years have witnessed the unending and uncontrollable rampage of imperialist violence, whose principal instigators have been the residents of the White House in Washington, D.C. Guterres' comment exemplifies the separation of the war in Ukraine from all that preceded it. It is as if the American and NATO wars of the last 3 decades had never happened. The violence and loss of life in Ukraine is being presented in the mass media as a horror without modern precedent. The crimes committed by the Russians are, it is claimed, of a character so extreme that they can be compared only to the atrocities of the Nazis. The invasion of Ukraine has been proclaimed an act of genocide, requiring nothing less than the establishment of a war crimes tribunal and the prosecution of Vladimir Putin. The allegations of genocide have been invoked by President Biden to justify the call for Putin's removal, that is, for regime change in Russia. Moreover, the propaganda campaign against Russia has been extended to criminalize the Russian people. Russian writers, musicians, athletes, scientists, and even the world historic achievements of Russian culture have been targeted for collective punishment. This vicious attack is aimed at promoting blind hatred of Russia to create the crazed environment necessary for all-out war. This is a well-known tactic of propaganda, which in its modern form is the product of World War I. Its purpose, as described by historian Robert Haswell Lutz as far back as 1933, is, and I quote, the creation of a new set of desires, group hypnosis, isolation of counter-propaganda, saturation of the public with selected and biased information, unquote. The development of these techniques has been perfected in the United States, and its most effective use was the Bush administration's claim in 2002-2003, entirely concocted, that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. The effectiveness of this campaign, as the Columbia Journalism Review explained in 2003, quote, was largely dependent on a compliant press that uncritically repeated every fraudulent administration claim about the threat posed to America by Saddam Hussein. Even if all the specific crimes attributed to the Russian military were true, and there has as yet been no credible substantiation of the allegations, such as the Bucha atrocity, they do not even begin to approach the dimensions of the documented crimes committed by the United States in the course of the wars it has waged over the last 30 years. The United States has, since 1991, bombed or invaded Iraq, Somalia, Serbia, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and Sudan. This is not a complete list, but the total number of deaths resulting from these invasions and bombings number several million people. The American media plays around with allegations of genocide as a means of blackguarding the targets of U.S. imperialism and, in the process, trivializing the real meaning of the word. But if the term genocide is to be used, it can be applied to the consequences of American interventions in the Middle East and Central Asia in just the last 3 decades. Biden denounces Putin as a war criminal who should be hauled before the tribunal at The Hague. Perhaps so. But based on the documented record of crimes committed by the United States, there are many American presidents and high state officials and generals who stand on the dock, or who should stand on the dock, alongside Putin. The claim that NATO's war against Russia is a response to unprovoked aggression against Ukraine is not the only fiction. In his latest remarks at the White House this past Thursday, Biden declared that he was asking Congress to allocate yet another mass amount of money, $33 billion, quote, to support Ukraine in its fight for freedom, unquote. But this is how the United States State Department described the state of freedom in Ukraine in its 2020 report, and I quote, "Significant human rights issues include unlawful and arbitrary killing, torture in cases of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment of detainees by law enforcement personnel, harsh and life-threatening conditions in prisons and detention centers, arbitrary arrest or detention, serious problems with the independence of the judiciary," unquote. The report also noted, quote, "serious acts of corruption, lack of investigation of and accountability for violence against women, violence or threats of violence motivated by anti-Semitism, crimes involving violence or threats of violence targeting persons with disabilities, members of ethnic minority groups, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or intersex person, and the existence of the worst forms of child labor," end of quote. The Ukraine government, the report complained, quote, "failed to take adequate steps to prosecute or punish most officials who committed abuses, resulting in a climate of impunity." Human rights groups and the United Nations noted significant deficiencies in investigations into alleged human rights abuses committed by government security forces, unquote. The Ukrainian government has banned the Communist Party and many other political organizations, and has also passed laws aimed at suppressing the use of the Russian language, which is the language of millions of Ukrainian people. These deficiencies are no longer reported by the media, which is now glorifying Ukraine's fledgling democracy and its president, Volodya Zelensky. But only recently, the International Monetary Fund and Western banks, while imposing a drastic regime of financial austerity on Ukraine, was bitterly denouncing Zelensky as the leader of a government embedded in corruption. Biden, who is unrestrained in his denunciation of Russian oligarchs, maintains a respectful silence on their counterparts in Ukraine, even though it is a well-known fact that a handful of billionaires control the impoverished country's economy. But of all the lies and false narratives employed to legitimize NATO's use of Ukraine as a proxy in the war against Russia, the most insidious and politically revealing are those that cover up the sordid history of fascistic nationalism in Ukraine, which carried out the mass murder of Poles and Jews during World War II. The media is silent on the elevation of Stepan Bandera, the mass murderer who led the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, during World War II, to the status of a cult-like figure. The glorification of Bandera and the members of the OUN and its armed wing, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, as national heroes began with the accession of Viktor Yushchenko to the presidency after the U.S.-sponsored Orange Revolution. After 2014, it became a crime to denigrate these fascistic and rabidly anti-Semitic heroes of genocidal nationalism. This falsification of history has served as the essential ideological foundation for the legitimization of armed fascist units in the present-day Ukrainian military, of which the Azov Battalion is the most notorious element. The Azov Battalion has played a central role in the bloody civil war in eastern Ukraine that has claimed since 2014 more than 14,000 lives. Its influence is not confined to Ukraine. As explained by one expert who has studied Azov's activities, I quote, "It's a movement that has served and will continue to serve as a model and inspiration for other far-right movements around the world. Its two-faced embrace of violence and its ambitions to be part of an increasingly powerful transnational far-right make it a threat beyond Ukraine's borders," unquote. In alliance with such reactionary forces, U.S. imperialism and its NATO allies are bringing the world to the brink of a nuclear catastrophe. the Biden administration is acting with a level of recklessness that borders on criminally insane behavior. Throughout the Cold War, it was accepted as indisputably true that an armed conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union had the potential to escalate into a devastating nuclear exchange and therefore had to be avoided. During the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, the overriding fear of President Kennedy was that a misreading of the adversary's intentions by leaders in Washington and Moscow could lead to a nuclear war. The Biden administration, not to mention its counterparts in London and Berlin, appear totally indifferent to that danger. The comments made by Biden are marked by obvious contradictions. Only several weeks ago, Biden stated that a military confrontation between the United States and Russia could lead to World War III. But now he is pouring weapons into Ukraine and multiplying the likelihood of direct conflict. It is not difficult to imagine a scenario in which Putin will feel compelled, based on political and military considerations, to directly attack countries that are supplying lethal weapons to Ukraine for use against Russian soldiers. How will the Biden administration respond if Russia retaliates against a NATO country and, as could well happen, strikes and kills American forces in the process? On the one hand, Biden dismisses Putin's threat to utilize nuclear weapons as merely expressions of desperation. But it is precisely a sense of desperation that increases the danger of a resort to nuclear weapons. This, however, does not seem to worry Biden. When he was directly asked whether he was concerned that Putin may act on the belief that it is at war with the United States, Biden shrugged the question off with the reply, "We are prepared for whatever they do." But this can only mean that the United States does in fact recognize that war between NATO and Russia has the potential to escalate to nuclear war. But neither Biden nor any other leader of the NATO countries have clearly acknowledged this danger or stated publicly what the consequences of a nuclear war would be. This deliberate concealment of the potentially catastrophic consequences of the U.S.-NATO war against Russia is a crime of historically monumental proportions. There is a general inclination to underestimate, if not dismiss, the danger of war. Most people tend to assume that because the consequences of nuclear war are so horrific, only the insane would allow it to happen. Reason, one assumes, must prevail in the end. But the entire history of the 20th century and of the first 2 decades of the 21st testifies against such self-assuring complacency. World War I and II, with their tens of millions of victims, happened. The outbreak of war is not a product of the insanity of individuals, but of the lethal contradictions of capitalism. U.S. Secretary General Guterres says that war in the 21st century is an absurdity. But this absurdity is linked to a host of other absurdities. The absurdity of class society, the absurdity of private ownership of the means of production, the absurdity of the concentration of unfathomable wealth in an infinitesimal percentage of the world's population, while billions of people live in grinding poverty and face starvation. The absurdity of the systematic destruction of the planet's ecology, and the greatest absurdity of all, the tribal division of humanity into nation-states that foment endless and unnecessary conflicts that serve only the interests of the corporate financial oligarchy that rules over all countries. Is it not absurd that the most powerful governments in the world have refused to take well-known and necessary public health measures to eradicate the SARS-CoV-2 virus, that has claimed approximately 20 million lives, and that it believes that the solution to the pandemic consists of simply ignoring it. But the same leaders who have presided over the disastrous response to the pandemic are now making the decisions that are leading to World War III. In their private discussions, President Biden, Prime Minister Johnson, President Macron, Chancellor Scholz, and for that matter President Putin, acknowledge among themselves that a world war would lead to a societal catastrophe. But in the 20th century, those who led their countries into the First and Second World Wars also feared the consequences of the global conflict. Even Hitler understood that his actions would lead to disaster. But that did not stop them. In the end, the leaders of world capitalism concluded that war offered the only way out of a complex of intractable political and socio-economic crises. This is the situation that exists today. The world capitalist system is afflicted by a complex of social, economic, and political contradictions for which there exist no peaceful solutions. The United States, the explosive epicenter of the world capitalist maelstrom, confronts simultaneously the loss of its hegemonic global position, the intractable deterioration of its economy, and the far advanced breakdown of its domestic political institutions and social equilibrium. Frightened by the looming danger of an economic crash, and terrified by the signs of a growing social radicalization of the working class, the ruling class sees war as a means of projecting internal tensions outward, of artificially unifying a profoundly divided country by hurling it into war. But the resort to war will intensify the crisis in the United States and all over the world. Already the effects of the war are being felt in inflation and the life-threatening curtailment of food and other necessities of life. These conditions have provoked mass strikes and demonstrations all over the world. The contradictions that threaten world war also create conditions for socialist revolution. The challenge that confronts the working class is this: to strengthen and accelerate the objective tendencies that lead to revolution while undermining and weakening those that lead to world war. The basis for the struggle against war is the movement of the working class. This is the great social force that has the power to stop war, put an end to capitalism, tear down national borders, and build a world socialist society. The International Committee of the Fourth International and its affiliated socialist equality parties and groups reject all chauvinist calls for the defense of the capitalist nation-state. We uphold the internationalist principles of Leon Trotsky, who wrote in 1934, "A socialist who preaches national defense is a petty bourgeois reactionary at the service of decaying capitalism. Not to bind itself to the national state in time of war, to follow not the war map, but the map of the class struggle, is possible only for that party that has already declared irreconcilable war on the national state in time of peace. Only by realizing fully the objectively reactionary role of the imperialist state can the proletarian vanguard become invulnerable to all types of social patriotism. This means that a real break with the ideology and policy of national defense is possible only from the standpoint of the international proletarian revolution." End of quote. Therefore, the central task is today the mobilization of the international working class against the imperialist drive to war. The reckless escalation must be stopped. The strength of the working class must be mobilized to bring about the end of the war in Ukraine. The International Committee today makes a special appeal to the courageous and class-conscious workers of Russia and Ukraine. Repudiate the reactionary policies of your capitalist governments. Reject the entire project of capitalist restoration, which has led to this terrible war. Return to the traditions of Marxism and Bolshevism, which once inspired the working people of your countries. We know that those traditions still live in the consciousness of the masses, and we are certain that they will reemerge in collective action. The American, European, and international working class must declare war on imperialist war. The most critical of all political tasks, therefore, is the building of the Fourth International as the World Party of Socialist Revolution. We call on all of you who agree with this perspective and are ready to take up this fight to join our ranks.
Thank you, Comrade North, for this powerful introduction. Yes, the working class must declare war on imperialist war, and it is beginning to do so. As the capitalist elites and their supporters in the affluent middle class are lurching towards World War III, there's powerful opposition developing in the international working class. In Russia itself, there exists a deep and principled opposition which opposes war on socialist principles. The ICFI has received a statement by the young guard of the Bolshevik Leninists in Russia, which they asked us to present at this rally.
Сегодня, великий исторический день рабочего интернационала и международной солидарности трудящихся, несмотря ни на какие преграды и запреты, тысячи рук по всему земному шару поднимут озаренные в лучах майского солнца красные знамена. Знамена, обогренные горячей кровью борцов за социализм. На протяжении всей истории капитализма они вели непримиримую войну с обществом угнетения и системой эксплуатации человека человеком ради повышенной нормы прибыли. Среди этих рук есть и мы, большевики-ленинцы, знающие свое место в истории этой борьбы и понимающие необходимость этой борьбы за будущее всего человечества. Большевики-ленинцы являлись реальной социальной альтернативой реакционному сталинскому курсу развития в СССР социализма в одной стране. Они вели свою борьбу против ревизии марксизма со стороны термидорианской сталинской бюрократии, деятельность которой в дальнейшем и привела к реставрации капитализма в СССР. Особое место среди большевиков-ленинцев занимал выдающийся революционный деятель Лев Давыдович Троцкий. Его несгибаемая воля к победе и стремление к свержению капиталистического общества помогла ему совершить величайшее событие XX века – Октябрьскую революцию 17 года. Большевистская партия, не без знаменитого апрельского вмешательства Ленина, смогла тогда сделать поистине грандиозное событие, последствия которого чувствуется и в наше время. Сила партии большевиков заключалась не только в быстрой адаптации к большим историческим событиям, но и в традициях, которые они защищали. Традиции, установленные Марксом и Энгельсом, на которых развивались и которые защищали Ленин и Троцкий, защищали и защищают большевики-ленинцы, заключаются в понимании исторической революционной роли пролетариата. Это понимание было получено в ходе огромной теоретической и практической работы, сделанной при помощи материалистической диалектики в областях научного социализма, истории, политэкономии и философии. Именно эти традиции мы продолжаем защищать от всякой ревизии, неизбежно заканчивающейся отказом от революционной роли рабочего класса, отказом от материалистической диалектики. Если посмотреть на каждую попытку ревизии марксизма, связанную с пересмотром таких фундаментальных основ, как исторический материализм, диалектика, научный социализм, трудовая теория стоимости, то каждая такая попытка была обречена откатиться назад к домарксовому пониманию философии, истории, и к политической экономике. А этот откат неизбежно означал переход ревизионистов, лагерь оппортунизма, лагерь защиты капитализма. Взгляд на марксистские традиции, которых придерживались Ленин и Троцкий, а затем и мы, закономерно привело нас к Международному комитету Четвертого интернационала, как единственной международной организации, все еще защищавшей исторические традиции октября, защищающей личность идеи Ленина и Троцкого от сталинской клеветы, организации, которая не потеряла свой пролетарский характер. Международный комитет, поддерживающий борьбу за социализм на интернациональной основе, стал для нас тем маяком, к которому должны стремиться все корабли марксистов-революционеров, чтобы объединиться в своей борьбе за свержение капиталистического строя и установить социализм во всем мире. Мы понимаем всю важность и сложность борьбы за социалистическое общество. Она неразрывно связана с объединением трудящихся в рамках международной организации, которая искренне и с огромным рвением ведет свою деятельность, стараясь одержать верх над обществом угнетателей. Мы считаем, что именно объединение всех передовых элементов рабочего класса и молодежи вокруг Международного комитета позволит трудящимся всего мира осуществить заветную цель построения бесклассового общества. Закономерный переход в лагерь Международного комитета был вызван в том числе и анализом текущей политической обстановки в мире и в России. Развитие международного кризиса капиталистической системы, вызванного противоречием между уровнем производительных сил и господствующим в обществе капиталистическими производительными отношениями, привело к обострению мировой напряженности. Пандемия коронавируса была триггерным событием и усугубления этого кризиса, его дальнейшая эскалация по всему миру. После распада СССР американский империализм решил установить однополярный мировой порядок. Его постепенное продвижение на восток привело к поддержке государственного переворота против пророссийского президента Януковича в Украине в 2014 году. Дальнейшее развитие внутреннего кризиса американского капитализма, вооружение Украины, принятие Крымской платформы, обострение отношений между НАТО и путинским режимом привело к реакционному вторжению Путина в Украину 24 февраля 2020 года. Это вторжение только усугубило мировую обстановку. Санкции, направленные против России, ударили в ответ не только по слаборазвитым, но и развитым странам. Слаборазвитые страны еще более остро стоят перед проблемой голода, а развитые сталкиваются с рекордным ростом стоимости жизни и увеличением уровня бедности населения. Вторжение показало, что у путинского режима нет адекватного решения проблем, стоящих не только перед одной Россией, но и всем миром. В той мере, в которой укрепление господства западного империализма за счет Китая и России не может принести разрешение проблем, имеющих международное, а не национальное ограниченное значение. В той же мере это не способен сделать путинский режим России или режим Си в Китае. Своей ответной агрессией, основанной на российском шовинизме или китайском национализме. Это неудивительно, ведь капиталистические режимы России и Китая установлены в ходе предательства сталинской бюрократии, основаны на частной собственности на средства производства, имеющие лишь национально ограниченный характер решения проблем, а потому не способные справиться с кризисом, имеющим международное значение, а значит и требующим международного характера собственного развития. В нашем мире есть только одна общественно-историческая сила, которая способна объединить человечество на интернациональной основе, и это рабочий класс. Только он является той социальной силой, которая увеличивается и крепнет с развитием капитализма, является его продуктом, а потому имеет реальную возможность для того, чтобы свергнуть капитализм и заменить его бесклассовым обществом, основанным на сознательном планировании производства, распределении ресурсов, отвечающим потребностям всего общества. Только объединившись вокруг этой революционной силы, которой служит Международный комитет Четвертого интернационала, партии социалистического равенства и молодой гвардии большевиков-ленинцев, мы будем способны воплотить в реальность социализм, за который сознательно и с воодушевлением боролись Карл Маркс, Фридрих Энгельс, Владимир Ленин, Лев Троцкий и многие другие, хоть и малоизвестные нам, но не менее важны для нашего дела борцы за светлое будущее. Правильное марксистское руководство закалит и объединит рабочий класс, поможет ему в исполнении своей революционной роли, но чтобы правильное руководство оставалось правильным, оно должно не забывать тех принципов, на которых стояли большевики и продолжают стоять большевики-ленинцы всего мира. Против реакционного вторжения путинского режима в Украину, за мобилизацию украинских и российских рабочих против войны, против военной эскалации западного империализма против России и Китая, за объединение международного рабочего класса, за социалистическое будущее.
Thank you, comrade. As our next speaker, I want to introduce Evan Blake. Comrade Evan is a leading member of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States and the coordinator of the Global Workers' Inquest into the COVID-19 pandemic. Evan has written extensively on the pandemic, including many interviews with scientists and workers, exposing and indicting the reckless and criminal policies of the ruling class, which led to the death of millions. Comrade Evan will speak on this monumental social crime and also present some of the initial findings of the inquest and explain what is necessary to eliminate this deadly virus. Comrade Evan.
Revolutionary greetings from Detroit, Michigan. This is the third May Day, where we meet under conditions of the COVID-19 pandemic. The official global death toll is approaching 6,260,000. Due to inadequate testing, reporting, and data collection throughout much of the world, experts believe that the real death toll is 3 times this figure and now stands at 20 million worldwide. The overwhelming majority of these deaths could have been prevented. The fundamental reason they were not is because world governments, acting on behalf of their ruling classes, consciously chose to subordinate public health to private profit and refused to coordinate internationally to stop the pandemic. The pandemic profiteers have amassed trillions of dollars. This year's Oxfam report notes that since the start of the pandemic, a new billionaire has been minted every 26 hours. The world's 10 richest men have doubled their wealth, as over 160 million people have been pushed into poverty. Nothing has revealed more clearly that the capitalist system is at war with its populations. Over the past year, the global death toll has more than doubled. These millions of deaths are all the more tragic because they took place after life-saving vaccines were first produced. Private ownership of the pharmaceutical monopolies and the pursuit of vaccine nationalism have created a situation where today only 59% of the world population has received an initial vaccine series. Criminally, only 0.6% of all people in low-income countries and only 1.5% of Africans have received a necessary booster shot. In 2020 and 2021, global life expectancy dropped by a combined nearly 2 years. These were the first annual declines in this figure since the UN began tracking it in 1950. On a per capita basis, Peru has been the hardest hit country in the world. 230,000 Peruvians have died from COVID-19, or 1 out of every 143 people in the country. In the United States, the center of world capitalism, 1.1 million people have been killed by the virus, and life expectancy has declined by over 2 years. In Russia, more than 1.2 million people have been killed by COVID, roughly 4 times the official figure, and more than double the per capita death rate experienced in the US. In India, 5.9 million people have succumbed to the virus, roughly 11 times higher than the official death toll. The eldest and most vulnerable have been the primary victims of the pandemic, but millions of working-age adults and tens of thousands of children have also perished worldwide. A study published in February found that by the end of last October, over 5.2 million children worldwide had lost a parent or primary caregiver to COVID-19. Every child impacted by these deaths has been deeply traumatized and faces a lifetime without these closest of their loved ones. The 20 million avoidable deaths are the most tragic result of the pandemic, but hundreds of millions of people worldwide are also now debilitated by long COVID. Numerous studies show that at least 10% of those infected with COVID go on to develop symptoms that linger for 3 months or more, with most suffering well over a year after their initial infection. These symptoms can affect nearly every organ in the body, and COVID-19 infection has now been linked to an increased risk of all-cause mortality, as well as heart disease, brain damage, diabetes, kidney disease, a dysregulated immune system, and more. From the earliest stages of the pandemic, the International Committee of the Fourth International not only warned of the potentially catastrophic consequences of the uncontrolled spread of SARS-CoV-2, we also advanced a strategy to stop the pandemic. In a statement published on February 28, 2020, the WSWS explained, quote, "The response to the coronavirus cannot be coordinated on nation-by-nation level. The virus does not respect borders or visa and immigration restrictions. The solution must be global. Scientists from all over the world must be allowed to share their research and technology unencumbered by the national interests and geopolitical conflicts that serve only to delay the development of effective countermeasures to contain, cure, and ultimately eradicate the coronavirus." End quote. The statement called for the utilization of all public health measures to stop the pandemic, the conversion of the giant healthcare companies into public utilities, and the provision of direct financial support to all workers and small business people. In numerous statements published over the course of 2020, we developed this program and demanded an end to the homicidal herd immunity strategy based on the forced reopening of schools and workplaces. This criminal policy, pioneered in Sweden, the US, the UK, Brazil, India, and other countries, led to the vast majority of deaths in the first year of the pandemic. On August 20, 2021, the WSWS warned, quote, "As long as the virus spreads, it will continue to mutate into new, more infectious, lethal, and vaccine-resistant variants that threaten all of humanity. Unless it is eradicated on a world scale, the embers of COVID-19 will continue to burn and create the conditions for the virus to flare up anew." End quote. This statement clarified the strategy of elimination eradication as the only means to stop the pandemic and save lives. We explained, quote, "Eradication entails the universal deployment of every weapon in the arsenal of measures to combat COVID-19, coordinated on a global scale, to stamp out the virus once and for all." End quote. In August and October 2021, we held webinars which brought together leading scientists from throughout the world to elaborate this strategy. These events were viewed by thousands of workers from over 100 countries. The ICFI, its affiliated socialist equality parties and groups, and the International Workers' Alliance of rank-and-file committees helped organize a series of global school strikes called by British parent Lisa Diaz. We assisted workers throughout the world in forming rank-and-file committees to fight for the elimination strategy. In late November, the WSWS initiated the Global Workers' Inquest into the COVID-19 pandemic to expose the lies and misinformation that have facilitated the murderous pandemic policies throughout the world. The inquest has begun gathering testimony from workers, scientists, and experts internationally, some of whom are shown here. Work on the inquest continues, but the initial findings already give a sense of the massive social crime that has been committed worldwide. We have documented the cover-up of the science of airborne transmission and its corollary in the promotion of unscientific anti-masking policies. We have spoken with experts on the herd immunity policies implemented in Sweden, Brazil, the US, and the UK, as well as scientists in Australia and other countries who have fought for elimination. We have documented the real-life experiences of workers in different industries throughout the world, including nurses, auto workers, musicians, doctors, educators, and more. Underscoring how prescient the launching of the inquest was, only 4 days later, news broke that the highly infectious and vaccine-resistant Omicron variant was spreading rapidly throughout southern Africa. Contrary to the lies of the politicians and media that Omicron is mild, global excess deaths reached roughly 40,000 per day in late January, the second highest figure on record, and so far 3.3 million people have been killed globally in 2022. During the Omicron surge, every country that had pursued a mitigationist approach fully embraced herd immunity, now based on the lie that COVID-19 is becoming endemic. In the process, they have systematically dismantled data surveillance and reporting, curtailed testing, and scrapped all mitigation measures, such as mask mandates. The world's ruling classes deliberately chose to abandon the fight against this novel infectious disease. Centuries of progress in human civilization, refracted through medical science and the development of public health, have been repudiated. While the far right has deliberately misled the public and denied the efficacy of vaccines, ostensibly liberal parties joined in the savage assault on public health. Even the most basic measures of isolation and quarantine, which date back to the Middle Ages, have been abandoned. In response to these brutal policies, the class struggle intensified throughout the world. In January, in at least 15 cities across the US and in countries throughout Europe, students, teachers, and parents took matters into their own hands and forced the closure of schools to stop viral transmission. The outbreak of the war in Ukraine in late February was then seized upon to stop all reporting on the pandemic and divert attention away from the cover-up of data and the ending of all public health measures. While doing nothing to stop the surge of Omicron BA1, BA2, and now further subvariants, the imperialist powers and their media continuously denounce China for maintaining a zero-COVID policy. Contrary to the dystopian portrayals of zero COVID in the Western media, there remains immense popular support for this policy within the Chinese working class. The effectiveness of China's zero COVID policy is empirical proof that elimination remains the only viable strategy to stop the pandemic. The fundamental limitation of zero COVID in China arises from the fact that the policy is confined to its national borders. If the public health measures implemented in China were adopted worldwide and combined with the airborne mitigations pioneered by scientists outside of China, the pandemic could be ended worldwide in a matter of months. The experience of China and the strategy outlined by the ICFI make clear that the vast majority of the 20 million lives lost over the past 2 years could have been saved. The pandemic has revealed the utter indifference of the ruling elites to mass death. They have now plunged mankind into a catastrophic war that threatens to spiral out of control and lead to nuclear war. The brutality of the pandemic has psychologically prepared them to carry out a war that could lead to the very extermination of mankind. Similarly, for decades, the capitalists and their politicians have consciously allowed climate change to worsen year after year, threatening to cause mass extinctions and kill hundreds of millions of people worldwide in the coming decades. A study published Thursday found that climate change will greatly increase the danger of future spillover events that could cause further pandemics in the coming years. All over the world, thousands of scientists have studied the pandemic, warned of its dangers, and fought to change policy in order to save lives. We are deeply gratified by their work. These courageous and selfless efforts have been sabotaged by capitalist governments. But there is another social force whose objective interests align with the principles of public health, the international working class. It is to this powerful and progressive class that scientists must turn. In the course of the pandemic, a monumental crime has been committed, the crime of social murder. There will be an accounting for this, and those responsible will be held accountable. Workers, young people, scientists, and progressive layers of the middle class must draw the necessary conclusions from this experience. The pandemic has exposed the economic, political, social, and moral bankruptcy of world capitalism, which must be overthrown. We call upon everyone participating in today's May Day rally. Take up the fight for global elimination. Until there is a global mass movement to end the pandemic, there will be wave after wave of mass infections and deaths, potentially for years to come. Participate in the Global Workers' Inquest. This must be expanded in every country and every section of the working class. While the ruling elites and their media declare the pandemic over, we must dig deeper and document all the crimes that have taken place and are deepening each day. Above all, the most critical task is the building of a Trotskyist revolutionary leadership in the working class of every country, fighting to stop the drive to world war and to initiate a global fight against COVID-19 and for world socialist revolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Evan. The ICFI and the WSWS insisted from the beginning that ending the pandemic is not primarily a medical issue, but a class question. Workers must take matters into their own hands and build a mass social and political movement to fight for the elimination and eradication of the virus once and for all. Workers in the US and internationally are building independent rank and file committees to fight the pandemic and defend their interests. We received many statements from workers in advance of this rally. Here's an especially powerful statement by Michelle, a working parent from Michigan, USA.
When I heard about the rank and file committee, it automatically drew my attention. I had this urge to fight, and I just didn't know how. You know, I kind of felt alone because I didn't know that there was other people that had the same feelings and the same mindset about what we were experiencing with COVID and our children. My daughter is a preschooler, and I know how hard it is for me to keep a mask on her, let alone on a bus, or let alone with a teacher who has other kids to watch. I can't even count how many times I received an email that said there was another positive case in the school. The main thing that I'm witnessing now is the inflation on everything. My energy bill, it's up $200 more than it typically is. Gas prices, food in general, it affects everybody, the working class, the people who don't have billions of dollars, the more and more homeless individuals that I'm seeing now than ever before, honestly. I can't find a job to where I'm not in close proximity with people. I have no choice. These auto workers, they're in constant contact with people. The teachers, they are taking care of children. They're in contact with parents. I have no choice but to go out and work and feed my family and take care of my home, or else we'll be one of the people that are homeless right now, and I can't afford for my kids to be homeless. I remember seeing a specific post on Facebook, and after seeing the rank and file committee in this post, it drove me over the edge. And, you know, I joined one rank and file committee. I joined late, and I was like, this is where I need to be. So I followed up to figure out when the next one was going to be, and I made sure I made it on time. The more known it gets, the more people will see that it's a place for them. The more understanding that they can get, just like the more understanding that I've gotten, the more that I've spoken with like-minded individuals about what's really going on. China made it safe for the people in their country, and that is what other countries need to take on and close down the schools, close down the auto plants. There was people that were delivering items to the home that you needed. They weren't in contact with people like that. If you feel like you don't agree with COVID, the May Day is going to be a great time for you to come forward and unite, because that's what we really need. We can't do it alone, and it's going to be the strength in numbers.
I would like to urge everyone to follow the example of Michelle and take a stand. Participate in the Global Workers' Inquest. Tell us what your experiences are with the pandemic, how this affected you and your colleagues and your family. The ICFI is building a movement of the working class to fight for an end to the pandemic. Join us. Fill out the form on this page, wsws.org/mayday, to get more involved. The theme of our next contribution will be the growing struggles of the international working class. Marxists have always insisted that the same contradictions that give rise to imperialist war produce an immense intensification of the class struggle. That is now happening. The social and economic crisis that was already advanced before the pandemic and the Ukraine war is now being accelerated throwing millions of workers across the globe into struggle. Speaking on this will be Eric London. Comrade Eric is a leading member of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States. He has not only written extensively on the development of the class struggle, but is playing an active role in many strikes and the building of the International Workers' Alliance of rank-and-file committees. Comrade Eric.
This is a map of the war in Ukraine. The imperialist powers' best-trained generals, foreign policy experts, and intelligence analysts have spent years hunched over this map, plotting offensives, positioning soldiers, gaming the enemy's response, and preparing public opinion with lies that turn the world on its head. But this is the map of the class struggle. It shows that a mass movement of historically unprecedented proportions is developing across the world. And this movement, depicted in this map, shows that the working class can stop world war and carry out the socialist transformation of the world. Each pin on this map is a strike that has taken place in the last 9 weeks since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine. Here are the strikes at the world's ports, each a critical choke point to international sea shipping. Purple marks the strikes by rail workers. Black denotes the strikes at many of the world's busiest airports. Each brown pin is a strike of bus, truck, waste collection, or delivery drivers. Orange indicates a strike of garment workers. Dark green pins are strikes by nurses. Light green shows strikes by oil and gas workers, and blue shows strikes by teachers, while gray depicts strikes by food production workers. Finally, yellow marks places where national strikes or mass protests have exploded over the rapidly rising cost of living, greatly exacerbated by NATO and US sanctions, which they call humanitarian, but which are throwing hundreds of millions to the brink of starvation. Each of these pins represents the tremendous courage and determination of the working class in struggle. Take the school teachers in the city of Nyala in South Darfur, Sudan, who all walked out in March the day after police attempted to burst into a classroom to arrest students who had participated in food protests that are spreading throughout the country. When teachers blocked the way to protect their pupils, police beat them brutally and publicly humiliated 3 teachers. But the demonstrations that followed in the working class were, according to local radio, massive and unprecedented. Teachers closed the schools and also the banks for good measure. The courage of teachers in Nyala spurred a renewed wave of national strikes and protests across the country, protesting against the military dictatorship and the unbearable cost of living. Workers are sacrificing their lives and freedoms in the fight for a better world as they confront the capitalist state, its police, militaries, and courts. In Sri Lanka, Charminda Lakshan, a 40-year-old husband and father, was shot and killed by police at a demonstration over fuel and food prices. 6 workers and youth were killed in protests in Peru, and over 90 have been killed in Sudan. Thousands of striking workers have been arrested in recent weeks for no crime at all. Such is justice in the capitalist courts of every country. In Maharashtra, India, 118 bus drivers participating in a major strike face criminal charges of rioting simply because they protested at the home of a politician who's attempting to privatize bus lines. What does this map tell us about the character of the emerging movement and the strategy that is required to meet workers' demands? The strikes and mass protests give a powerful sense of the character of the international working class in the 21st century and its organic striving for unity. This growing movement is breaking down all the artificial divisions of race, religion, and ethnicity used by the ruling class to divide workers against each other. In Vietnam, electronics workers demanded a bonus for the Tet holiday to cover rising food prices, while textile workers in Bangladesh struck for a bonus for Ramadan. Oil workers in Iraq and Iran engaged in simultaneous strikes separated by only several miles of territory over which their fathers were sent by the governments to kill each other only 35 years ago. Indian teachers in Punjab and Pakistani teachers in next-door Lahore share the same strike demands, even though each of those governments has nuclear missiles trained at the other's population centers. and Sinhala and Tamil workers are demonstrating side by side against the Rajapaksa government in Sri Lanka. Most importantly, strikes are growing in the centers of world imperialism, especially in the United States and Britain, where the government's extreme recklessness in war is a desperate and failed attempt to divert the class struggle towards an external enemy. The strike movement also demonstrates the immense power workers occupy amid fragile global supply chains. In one wildcat strike last Friday in Amsterdam, a few dozen airport baggage workers at Schiphol Airport slowed international air travel when they gathered in the canteen one morning, talked about their conditions, and decided not to load bags. Within minutes of the start of the wildcat strike, the airport had effectively shut down and flights were canceled across Europe. The corporate media was horrified. Dutch newspapers were outraged, especially over the inconvenience to luxury vacationers. One melodramatic headline read, quote, "Victims of the chaos at Schiphol," and quoted a wealthy vacationer, "We were looking forward to a Spanish terrace." Well, the class struggle demands great sacrifices of us all. In many countries, strikes and protests are developing into insurrectionary struggles. Massive levels of social inequality, record corporate profits, the social and economic impact of a coronavirus pandemic that has unnecessarily killed 20 million people have lit the fuse to a social powder keg of global class tensions that cannot be extinguished. In Peru, which has suffered the highest number of per capita COVID deaths, as well as in Sri Lanka and Sudan, the governments confront protests and strike movements that threaten to develop into revolutionary upsurges. In Iran and South Africa, strike waves are growing larger every day. In almost every country in the world, journalists and NGO directors nervously warn that their country will be the next domino to fall. And given the developing impact the war will have on food prices and fertilizer shortages as the weeks go by, they will all be proven correct. The global movement is overcoming and developing over the heads of the trade unions, whose roots in the national state system make them a barrier, not a vehicle, for unlocking the power of this international movement. In not a single case have the unions actually led workers into struggle, informed them of the struggles by their international co-workers, or encouraged their strivings for equality. The Turkish government reports 106 wildcat strikes took place there in the first 2 months of 2022, more than the total number of wildcats over the previous 5 years combined. In Vietnam, the government says wildcat strikes increased 40% in the first 3 months of the year. A powerful wildcat movement is developing in Brazil, where the unions print pathetic little leaflets telling workers that it's not the right time to strike. And in the U.S., the head of the Steelworkers Union tells the Biden administration that it will ensure wages stay below inflation to help the war drive against Russia. This is the emerging movement of an international working class that has never before occupied such a powerful position under capitalism. Since the end of the Second World War, the globalization of the world economy has raised up a working class comprised of billions of people, interconnected by the process of production and working and living together in massive cities the likes of which human history has never seen. In the global south, an unprecedented migration has taken place from the countryside to the cities all over the world. In 2008, for the first time in world history, a majority of the population of the world lived in urban areas. And also for the first time, through the internet and social media, workers are able to communicate with literally unlimited number of their fellow workers from the palm of their hands. The globalized world economy is pregnant with a socialist society that is ready to be born, but is constrained by the national state system and private ownership of the means of production, and in conditions where the working class is held back by the trade unions and capitalist parties. The 2011 Arab Spring and the 2018-19 global protests show that no matter how courageous, no matter how much workers are willing to sacrifice, spontaneous anger is incapable on its own of addressing the burning challenges workers confront all over the world. Appealing to the ruling class to change its ways will not pressure them to play nice. On the contrary, such appeals only heighten the bourgeoisie's sense of self-preservation. The capitalist class possesses hundreds of years of experience in cajoling, threatening, dividing, duping, promising, and terrorizing the working class in order to break its resistance. Rank-and-file committees are the form of organization needed to meet the needs of this growing movement. They are the historically necessary organ of international working class struggle in the 21st century. The International Workers' Alliance of Rank-and-File Committees is an international working class organization established by the International Committee of the Fourth International at the May Day rally held 1 year ago, to unite and provide support and leadership for the development of workers' rank-and-file committees worldwide. The IWARFC's purpose is to draw the different sections of the working class, all its heterogeneous layers and component parts, into one unified movement, to help it unlock its tremendous social power, to encourage its organic striving for independence and unity, to introduce workers to the historical lessons of the class struggle, and to free them from the handcuffs of national trade unionism so that they can extend their hands across industries and across national boundaries to their fellow workers in a global struggle to take power out of the hands of the financial aristocracy and imperialist warmongers. We are guided by the example set by Lenin and Trotsky in the Russian Revolution of 1917, which ended the First World War and marked a new stage in the struggle for socialism on a world scale. Like the Bolsheviks in 1917, we know that all workers do not begin these struggles as self-conscious socialists, but in the course of fighting side by side with them and proving ourselves as the best fighters, the International Committee of the Fourth International and its cadre throughout the world will demonstrate our right to leadership to the working class, win them to socialism, and change the course of history.
Thank you, Comrade Eric. Eric's speech underscored the importance of our initiative at last year's May Day rally to form the International Workers' Alliance of Rank-and-File Committees. Again, I would like to encourage every worker listening in today to join the IWA-RFC and fight to establish an independent rank-and-file committee at your workplace. The development of the World Socialist website's coverage of the struggles of workers throughout the world and our fight to reach ever broader layers of workers internationally requires resources. Please make a generous financial donation today. Go to wsws.org/donate. Our next speaker will be Comrade Keith Jones, the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party in Canada. Canadian imperialism is playing a particularly provocative role in the escalating US-NATO war against Russia. Historically, there has been close ties between the Canadian ruling class and the far-right Ukrainian nationalists who are now cynically promoted as defenders of democracy and armed to the teeth against Russia. Please welcome Comrade Keith.
The Socialist Equality Party Canada joins with its sister parties in the International Committee of the Fourth International in summoning the working class to oppose the reckless, ever-escalating US-NATO war on Russia. Absent the revolutionary intervention of the international working class, the imperialist powers will plunge humanity into a global conflagration as they did twice before in the last century. Canadian imperialism is playing an especially provocative and belligerent role in the Ukraine war, as it did in the war's preparation and instigation. Over the past quarter century, under Liberal and Conservative governments alike, Canada has enthusiastically supported the US-led drive to encircle Russia and to harness Ukraine to NATO and the European Union. From 2015, hundreds of Canadian Armed Forces trainers were deployed to Ukraine, where they worked alongside American and British military personnel to reorganize Ukraine's armed forces. This included helping integrate and train the fascists of the Azov Battalion. The Trudeau Liberal government has led the charge for all-out economic warfare against Russia. Working in tandem with Britain's Tory regime, it pressed for Russia's exclusion from the SWIFT banking system and the seizure of the assets of Russia's central bank. Since January, Canada has pledged to deliver $618 million worth of military aid to Ukraine by no later than next March. The first shipment of heavy weaponry arrived last week. Behind a smokescreen of poisonous war propaganda, the Canadian ruling class is pursuing the most predatory economic and geopolitical objectives. Under conditions of systemic capitalist crisis, it is determined to strengthen its 8 decades-old military security alliance with Washington, which it deems pivotal to securing and expanding its extensive global imperialist interests. Canada also has its own strategic rivalry with Russia. This is particularly true in the Arctic, where climate change is making the exploitation of natural resources and sea lanes ever more viable. But there is a third important factor propelling Canada's outside role in the US-NATO war on Russia: the Canadian state's long-standing alliance with the Ukrainian far right. After the fall of Hitler's Third Reich, Canada provided refuge to tens of thousands of Ukrainian fascists who had collaborated with the Nazis in some of the 20th century's most monstrous crimes and carried out their own mass slaughter of Jews and Poles in pursuit of an ethnically pure Ukrainian state. Canadian imperialism used these forces as tools in its Cold War foreign and domestic policy. This included helping them cover up and whitewash their crimes. In the late 1980s and 1990s, the Ukrainian Canadian far right was deployed to press for capitalist restoration, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and subsequently for independent Ukraine's transformation into a vassal of the Western imperialist powers. The Ukrainian-Canadian Congress has long served as the nexus of the collaboration between the Canadian state and the far-right Ukrainian nationalists. The UCC, writes a noted Ukrainian-Canadian historian, has put the glorification of the Nazis' Ukrainian fascist collaborators at the very center of the Ukrainian national identity project. The alliance between Canadian imperialism and the Ukrainian far right is most strikingly embodied in the person of Chrystia Freeland, Canada's Deputy Prime Minister, Finance Minister, and Chief Architect of its feminist foreign policy. Freeland has often written and spoken of her schooling in Ukrainian nationalism by her beloved grandfather. To describe Freeland's maternal grandfather, Michael Chomiak, as a Nazi collaborator is to be charitable. From January 1940 through the first months of 1945, he edited the sole Ukrainian language newspaper in Nazi-occupied Poland. Kravitsky Vista leonized Adolf Hitler, celebrated the Nazi war of extermination against the Soviet Union, incited hatred for Jews, and promoted the formation of a Ukrainian division of the Waffen-SS. The leading anti-Russia war hawk in Canada's government, Freeland has come to play an important role in Ukrainian domestic politics. Every evening, she speaks by phone to Ukraine's Prime Minister and Finance Minister. At gatherings of her Ukrainian-Canadian allies, Freeland routinely invokes symbols and rituals associated with the World War II Ukrainian fascists. When her political ancestry was exposed in 2017, the entire political establishment and corporate media joined Freeland in curtly dismissing it as Russian disinformation. No investigation of the Canadian state's patronage of the Ukraine far right was to be permitted. Above all, its contemporary iteration, be it the use of Ukrainian fascists as shock troops in the 2014 US-orchestrated, Canadian-assisted coup that overthrew Ukraine's democratically elected pro-Russian president, the Canadian Armed Forces training of the fascists embedded in Ukraine's armed forces, or the state-sponsored Ukrainian-Canadian Congress's role in ideologically and materially promoting the Ukrainian far right and its exclusivist, virulently anti-communist nationalism. The unanimous denunciations of Russian disinformation in the Freeland affair were a small anticipation of the anti-Russia war fever that now unites Canada's entire political establishment, from right to ostensibly left, federalist and pro-Quebec independence. The Social Democrats of the NDP, with the full-throated support of the trade unions, responded to the war's outbreak by forming a governmental alliance with Trudeau and Freeland. In the name of political stability, the NDP has pledged to keep the minority Liberal government in power to June 2025 as it wages war, dramatically hikes military spending, and pivots to imposing austerity and inflation-driven real wage cuts. This is a continuation and escalation of the role that the unions and NDP have played throughout the pandemic. In March, April 2020, they supported the Trudeau government's funneling of hundreds of billions of dollars into the financial markets and banks and corporate coffers, then policed the ruinous back-to-work, back-to-school policy that has resulted in 6 successive waves of mass infection and death that have officially killed more than 39,000 Canadians. Writing in the transitional program, Leon Trotsky observed that in times of extreme crisis like war, trade union leaders become bourgeois ministers. The Union NDP Liberal Alliance is aimed at suppressing the class struggle so as to give the Canadian ruling class a free hand in waging imperialist war abroad and class war at home. They will not succeed. The pandemic, the war, their ruinous economic fallout, and decades of austerity and ever-widening social inequality are impelling workers in Canada, like their class brothers and sisters around the world, into struggle. Moreover, these struggles are increasingly erupting in opposition to and outside the corporatist trade unions and phony establishment left parties. The great challenge is to impart these struggles with a clear socialist internationalist program and perspective. That is the task of the ICFI and its socialist equality parties. I appeal to you to join us in this fight.
Thank you, Comrade Keith. Our next speaker is Thomas Castanheira. He's a leading member of the Socialist Equality Group in Brazil, which is fighting to establish a section of the ICFI in Brazil and build the Trotskyist movement throughout Latin America. The continent is among the regions most severely affected by the pandemic and now by the economic and political impact of the war in Ukraine. Comrade Thomas has written extensively on political developments in Brazil. He is the author of many important statements laying out a socialist perspective and program for the explosive struggles which are now developing across Latin America. Greetings, Comrade Thomas.
Companheiros e amigos, neste 1º de maio histórico, o Comitê Internacional da Quarta Internacional convoca os trabalhadores de todos os países a uma luta internacionalmente unificada contra a guerra imperialista, a infinita pandemia de Covid-19 e a verdadeira causa de ambos, o sistema capitalista em decomposição. Em nome do Grupo Socialista pela Igualdade do Brasil, apelo aos trabalhadores brasileiros e latino-americanos a se unirem a esta luta. Somente a colaboração entre a classe trabalhadora nos países oprimidos e nos países imperialistas, com a perspectiva do socialismo internacional, é capaz de derrubar o imperialismo ao redor do mundo e garantir o desenvolvimento de toda a humanidade. Nos últimos anos, em todos os países, a classe capitalista se revelou totalmente incapaz de seguir governando a sociedade. Na América Latina, terra da extrema desigualdade social, os bilionários se multiplicaram em meio à pandemia, enquanto as massas foram lançadas décadas para trás em seus níveis de vida. Enquanto se estima que os impactos da guerra na Ucrânia sobre os preços dos combustíveis e alimentos serão responsáveis por manter mais de 10 milhões de latino-americanos na miséria, a elite financeira especula sobre as oportunidades de lucro abertas pela guerra. Há vários países que importam da Rússia e da Ucrânia os mesmos produtos que da América Latina e do Caribe. Vamos aproveitar, declarou o presidente do Banco Interamericano, de desenvolvimento. As ilusões fomentadas por representantes da burguesia latino-americana e seus meios de comunicação, de que são capazes de brincar de longe com o fogo da guerra imperialista, sinalizam que a classe trabalhadora precisa urgentemente assumir as rédeas da situação. Uma nova guerra mundial colocará necessariamente a América Latina no mapa do conflito, numa escala incomparável com as duas guerras anteriores. Os Estados Unidos enxergam a guerra por procuração que estão travando com a Rússia na Ucrânia como a primeira fase de uma escalada militar contra a China. A dependência chinesa das matérias-primas exportadas por países como Brasil, Chile, Peru e Argentina, assim como seus investimentos nos mercados latino-americanos, são pontos estratégicos nos cálculos de guerra das potências imperialistas. A última grande guerra mundial trouxe a erupção do imperialismo americano na arena mundial. No manifesto da Quarta Internacional sobre a Guerra Imperialista e a Revolução Proletária, escrito em 1940, Trotsky apontou que o monstruoso armamento dos Estados Unidos preparava uma resolução violenta das complexas contradições do hemisfério ocidental. A política de boa vizinhança dos Estados Unidos na América Latina seria rapidamente substituída pela dominação com um punho de ferro. Essas previsões foram tragicamente confirmadas no período do pós-guerra, promovendo intervenções, golpes e ditaduras militares brutais, golpe no Brasil em 64, no Chile em 73, na Argentina em 76, a Guerra dos Contras na Nicarágua nos anos 80 e muitos outros, o imperialismo americano afogou em sangue o espírito revolucionário do jovem proletariado latino-americano. A nova guerra imperialista fomentada pelos EUA é uma expressão não de força, mas do declínio histórico do capitalismo americano. No seu período de crise, o poder militar dos Estados Unidos se impõe de forma mais selvagem e inescrupulosa na busca pela dominação mundial. Mas, parafraseando Marx, a burguesia imperialista se assemelha ao feiticeiro incapaz de controlar os poderes infernais que invocou. Cada ação militar que toma, no desespero de manter-se no poder, gera uma nova e mais incontrolável explosão da luta de classes. A destruição das condições de vida das massas sob o capitalismo está levando a classe trabalhadora, na América Latina e em todo o mundo, à via de enfrentamento com o poder burguês vigente. Em consequência imediata da guerra na Ucrânia, protestos de massas estouraram no Peru contra o aumento do preço dos combustíveis. As mesmas condições alimentam uma onda de greves no Brasil em dezenas de categorias. Significativamente, uma greve selvagem foi deflagrada por operários da CSN na maior usina de aço do continente. Os trabalhadores dizem estar confrontando as perdas impostas sistematicamente pelos sindicatos desde a última grande greve na CSN em 1988. Essas lutas são apenas os primeiros sintomas de batalhas de classe que estão na agenda. Elas seguem a maior onda de manifestações em décadas que varreu países como Chile, Bolívia, Equador, Colômbia e Brasil, imediatamente antes e durante a pandemia de Covid-19. Segurando uma bomba relógio social, a burguesia latino-americana passa de um governo em crise para outro. Uma nova onda da maré rosa na região já nasce com a sua face mais reacionária voltada para cima. Com meses de mandato, o governo do líder sindical, Pedro Castillo, no Peru, já tem as mãos sujas de sangue de manifestantes assassinados pelo exército. No Chile, o pseudo-esquerdista Boric segue o mesmo caminho, apelando aos odiados carabineiros a pôr ordem nas ruas. Um novo governo de Lula do Partido dos Trabalhadores no Brasil não seria diferente, disputando a presidência com o semifascista Jair Bolsonaro, que prepara ativamente um golpe eleitoral aos moldes do 6 de janeiro de Trump nos Estados Unidos, Lula jurou a sua obsessão em garantir, junto dos sindicatos, os lucros das empresas transnacionais para mantê-las no país. Os interesses dos trabalhadores não serão atendidos por nenhuma dessas falsas alternativas burguesas. É preciso lutar pela total independência política da classe trabalhadora. As condições objetivas jamais foram tão propícias para a Revolução Socialista. A América Latina e nas outras ex-colônias, a classe trabalhadora é hoje a maioria esmagadora da sociedade. Está aglomerada em grandes centros urbanos e conectada pelo processo de produção capitalista e pela internet aos trabalhadores de todo o mundo. A tarefa que enfrentamos neste 1º de maio é transformar essas condições objetivas num movimento consciente da classe trabalhadora mundial contra a guerra, a pandemia e a desigualdade social e pelo socialismo internacional. O elemento essencial para esse processo é a construção do Partido Mundial da Revolução Socialista, o Comitê Internacional da Quarta Internacional. Participe dessa luta pelo futuro.
Thank you, Comrade Thomas. It is of particular significance that we will have now 2 comrades from Sri Lanka addressing this rally. Sri Lanka is presently at the center of the upsurge of the international class struggle. Enormous social anger over rising food and gasoline prices, power outages, lack of medical care, and more generally, increasingly unbearable living conditions for the working population has erupted in mass protests across the island. Last Thursday, millions of workers participated in a one-day general strike demanding the ouster of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and his government. Our comrades in Sri Lanka are playing an active role in the mass movement and are advancing a socialist program for action for the working class to defend its social and democratic rights. Our first speaker from Sri Lanka will be Comrade Dipal Jayasekara. He is the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party in Sri Lanka. Comrade Jayasekara has written extensively on Sri Lanka, the entire Indian subcontinent, and the national question and the struggle for permanent revolution in South Asia. Please welcome from Colombo, Comrade Jayasekara.
සහෝදරවරුනි සහෝදරියනි දකුණු ආසියාවේ සෑම ධනේශ්වර ආණ්ඩුවක්ම වසර 2කට වඩා වැඩි COVID-19 වසංගතයත් යුක්‍රේනය තුල රුසියාවට එරෙහි වත්මන් එක්සත් ජනපද නැටෝ වක්‍ර යුද්ධයත් විසින් අතිශයින් උස්සන්න කෙරුණු ගෝලීය ධනවාදයේ අතිමහත් ආර්ථික දේශපාලන සහ සමාජීය අර්බුදය මගින් වෙලාගෙන තියෙනවා. පන්ති අරගලයේ ජාත්‍යන්තර නැග්මේ කොටසක් ලෙස දකුණු ආසියාව පුරා කම්පරුවන් තරුණයන් සහ ගම්බද දුගීන් වර්ජන හා මහජන විරෝධතා ඇතුළු අරගලවලට අවතීර්ණ වෙලා ඉන්නවා. ඒ ආර්ථික අර්බුදයේ මුළු බර ඔවුන් මැත්තේ කඩාපාත් කරමින් පාලක පන්තිය ඔවුන්ගේ මූලික සමාජ හා ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍ර අයිතීන් මත එල්ල කරන ප්‍රහාරයට එරෙහිවයි. ඉන්දියාව එක්සත් ජනපද නැටෝ වක්‍ර යුද්ධයේ බලපෑමට අහු වෙලා තියෙනවා. චීනයට එරෙහි එක්සත් ජනපද ඉන්දියානු මිලිටරි මූලෝපායික හවුල්කාරීත්වයේ ආකාරයටම ඉන්දියාව මොස්කව් සමග පවතින සිය දශක ගණනාවක සම්බන්ධතා බිඳදාලා මොස්කව් වලට එරෙහිව එක්සත් ජනපදයේ සමග සමීපව පෙළගැසිය යුතුයයි වොෂින්ටනය දිල්ලි පාලනය මත එල්ල කරන පීඩනය උස්සන්න කරනවා. රුසියාවට එරෙහි එක්සත් ජනපද නැටෝ යුද දාවනය සහ එහා බැඳුණු මොස්කෝවට එරෙහි රුදුරු සම්පාදක සහ එහි ප්‍රතිඵලයක් ලෙස ගෝලීය සැපවින්ජාලය බිඳවැටීම ඉන්දියාව මත දරුණු ලෙස බලපාලා එහි ආර්ථික අර්බුදය තවදුරටත් උග්‍ර කරලා. මේ තත්ත්වය යටතේ ඉන්දියාවේ කම්පරු පන්තිය සහ ගම්බද පීඩිතයන් අගමැති නරේන්ද්‍ර මෝදිගේ ආණ්ඩුව ඔවුන්ගේ සමාජ හා ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍ර අයිතීන්ට එල්ල කරන උස්සන්න කෙරුණු ප්‍රහාරයන්ට එරෙහිව අරගලවලට අවතීර්ණ වෙමින් ඉන්නවා. පහුගිය මාර්තු 28-29 දිනවල පැවති මහා වැඩවර්ජනයට කම්පරුවෝ මිලියන ගණනින් සහභාගී වුණා. ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේදී ධනවාදයේ ගෝලීය අර්බුදය එහි තියුණුම ප්‍රකාශනය අත්පත් කරගෙන තියෙනවා. ඒ ජනාධිපති ගෝඨාභය රාජපක්ෂ සහ ඔහුගේ ආණ්ඩුව ඉල්ලා අස්වැන්න ලෙස බල කරමින් දිවයින පුරා වැඩෙන මහජන විරෝධතා මගින් ආණ්ඩුව අරටුවටම සොලවාලිමින්. අප්‍රේල් 9 වෙනිදා ඉඳන් කොළඹ ගාලු මුවදොර පිටියේ ප්‍රධාන විරෝධතා භූමියේ දහස් ගණනින් දිවාරය නතර වී එක දිගට විරෝධතාවල යෙදෙනවා. මහජන විරෝධතා ප්‍රධාන කොටම පිපිරලා තියෙන්නේ තෙල්, ගෑස් සහ ඖෂධ වැනි අත්‍යවශ්‍ය ද්‍රව්‍ය වල හිඟකම, ඒ වගේම ඒවායේ මිල ගණන් අහස උසර නැගීම සහ දිනපතා පෑ ගාණක් විදුලිය කප්පාදු කිරීම අරබයා පැන නැගිලා තියෙන පුළුල් වෛරය නිසායි. කම්පරු පන්තිය ભેද කරලා දුර්වල කරන්න වර්ගෝත්තමාදය ඇවිලවීමට ධනපති පාලක පන්තියේ සියලුම කොටස් ගෙන යන දශක ගණනාවක ප්‍රතිගාමී ප්‍රයත්නයන්ට අභියෝග කරමි. මේ මහජන නැගිටීම ඇතුලේ වැඩ කරන ජනතාව තරුණයෝ, වෘත්තිකයෝ හා ගම්බද පීඩිතයෝ සිංහල, දෙමළ, මුස්ලිම්, බෞද්ධ, හින්දු සහ ක්‍රිස්තියානි ඇතුළු සියලු භාෂාමය හා ආගමික වාර්ගික රේඛා කපාගෙන එකමුතු වෙලා ඉන්නවා. දැන් කම්පරු පන්තිය මැදිහත් වෙන්න තීන්දුව කිරීමත් එක්ක මහජන විරෝධතා ව්‍යාපාරය සම්දිස්ථානයකට ළඟා වෙලා. අප්‍රේල් 25 වෙනිදා රාජපක්ෂ ආණ්ඩුව ඉල්ලා අස්වන ලෙස බල කරමින් දිවයින පුරා 2,50,000ක් පමණ ගුරුවරු එක් දින වර්ජනයකට එක් වුණා. ඊට දවස් 3කට පස්සේ මිලියන සංඛ්‍යාත කම්පරුවෝ ඒ ඉල්ලීම මතම රට පුරා එක් දින මහා වැඩ වර්ජනයකට එකතු වුණා. කම්පරු පන්තිය අරගරවලට ඇතුළු වීම සමග රාජපක්ෂ ආණ්ඩුව මුහුණ දෙන දේශපාලන අර්බුදය තවදුරටත් ගැඹුරු වෙලා. දැන් ආණ්ඩුව නූලෙන් එල්ලිලා ඉන්නේ. ඔවුන්ගේ මන්ත්‍රීලා 40ක් පමණ අනාගතයේදී ස්වාධීනව කටයුතු කරන බව දැනුම් දීමත් එක්ක ආණ්ඩුවේ බහුතරය සඵල ලෙස නැති වෙලා. බලයේ එල්ලිලා ඉන්න මම්මුලා සහගත උත්සාහයක යෙදෙමින් රාජපක්ෂ ආණ්ඩුව කල්යල් බලමින් මහජන නැගිටීමට එරෙහිව මුර්ග පොලිස් මිලිටරි මර්දනයක් දියත් කරන්න ගණන් බලනවා. අප්‍රේල් 11 වෙනිදා ජාතිය අමතක කළපු කතාවකදී අගමැති මහින්ද රාජපක්ෂ ආණ්ඩු විරෝධී විරෝධතාකරුවන්ට තර්ජනය කළා. ඔවුන් තමන්ගේ ව්‍යාපාරය නතර කරේ නැත්නම් ආණ්ඩුව මුර්ග මර්දනයක් දියත් කරනවා කියලා. ඒකෙන් යම්තම් දින 8කට පස්සේ හොඳින් සන්නද්ධ පොලිස් බලයනියක් රඹුක්කනදී තෙල් මිල ඉහළ දැමීමට විරෝධය පළ කරපු දහස් ගණනකට වෙඩි ප්‍රහාරයක් එල්ල කරලා චමින්ද ලක්ෂාස් කියන කම්පරුව ඝාතනය කළා. තවත් දුසින් ගණනාවකට තුවාල සිද්ධ කළා. මේ වැඩි තැබීම ආණ්ඩුව ක්‍රියාවට දමන දරුණු කප්පාදු පිළිවෙත් වලට එරෙහි මහජන විරෝධය පලා දාන්න ආණ්ඩුව සූදානම් බවට වැඩ කරන ජනතාවට හා ගම්බද පීඩිතයන්ට කරපු පැහැදිලි අනතුරු වැගවීමක් වගේම ඒ සම්බන්ධයෙන් ආයෝජකයන්ට හා ගෝලීය බැංකුකරුවන්ට කරපු පැහැදිලි සංඥාවක්. ආණ්ඩුව වගේම ධනේශ්වර විරුද්ධ පක්ෂත් බයභීතිකාවට පත් වෙලා ඉන්නවා. වත්මන් ආණ්ඩු විරෝධී මහජන නැගිටීම සමස්තයක් විදියට ධනපති පාලනයටම අභියෝග කරන සටන්කාමී ව්‍යාපාරයක් බවට වර්ධනය වීමේ හැකියාව ගැන. පාලක පන්තියේ කොටස් පාර්ලිමේන්තුවේ ප්‍රධාන විරුද්ධ පක්ෂ වන සමගි ජනබලවේගය සහ ජනතා විමුක්ති පෙරමුණ අන්තර්වාර ආණ්ඩුවක් ඇටවීම හරහා මේ ව්‍යාපාරය ධනපති පාලනය තුළම කොටු කරන්න වැඩ කරනවා. ඒ වගේ අන්තර්වාර ආණ්ඩුවක් නිසකෝම වැඩ කරන ජනතාව සහ ගම්බද පීඩිතයන් මුහුණ දෙන කොන්දේසි තව තවත් දරුණු කරමින් ජාත්‍යන්තර මූල්‍ය අරමුදල නියෝග කරන ඒ කප්පාදු පිළිවෙත්ම ඉදිරියට ගෙන යනවා ඇති. මුර්ග මර්දනයක් සඳහා යන ආණ්ඩුවේ සූදානමත් විරුද්ධ පක්ෂවල අන්තර්වාර ආණ්ඩු උගුලත් යටතේ ආණ්ඩු විරෝධී මහජන ව්‍යාපාරය බරපතල අන්තරායකටයි මුහුණ දීලා ඉන්නේ. එහි අදිෂ්ඨානය හා සටන්කාමීත්වය තිබියදීම ධනේශ්වර පාලනයට එරෙහිව සටන් බැදීම පිණිස එයට පැහැදිලි දේශපාලන ඉදිරි දර්ශනයක් හා ක්‍රියාමාර්ගයක් නැතිකමින් ගලා එන අන්තරායක්. මේ කාරණා පැහැදිලිවම පෙන්눔 කෙරුණා. ගාලු මූදර විරෝධතාකරුවන් සමග සාකච්ඡා කරන්න තමන් සූදානම් බවට අප්‍රේල් 13 වෙනිදා අගමැති කරපු යෝජනාව ප්‍රතික්ෂේප කරමින් ඒ විරෝධතා ව්‍යාපාරයේ සංවිධායකයන් ප්‍රසිද්ධ කළ විකල්ප යෝජනා ලැස්තුවෙන් ගෝඨාභය රාජපක්ෂත් මහින්ද රාජපක්ෂත් ඉල්ලා අස්වෙන්න ඕන කියලා ඉල්ලා සිටින අතරෙම ඕන් ඉදිරිපත් කරන්නේ පවතින පාර්ලිමේන්තුවෙන් අන්තර්වාර ආණ්ඩුවක් පිහිටුවීම, ඒ ආණ්ඩුවට රාජපක්ෂ පවුලේ කිසිවෙකු සම්බන්ධ කරනවා ගැනීම, පුළුල් ලෙස වෛරයට ලක් වෙලා තියෙන විජායක ජනාධිපති තනතුරේ සමහර බලතල සුළු වශයෙන් කප්පාදු කරන දහම් මොන විශ්වාසතා සංශෝධනය යලි බලාත්මක කිරීම, රාජපක්ෂ පවුලේ සමාජිකයෝයි උන්ට සම්බන්ධිත නිලධාරීනුයි සොරකම් කරපු සියලු ධනය ආපහු ලබා ගන්න යාන්ත්‍රණයක් සකස් කිරීම සහ මාස 6ක් ඇතුළත ජනාධිපතිවරණයක් සහ මහමෙතරණයක් පැවැත්වීම යනාදී ඉල්ලීම්. ගාලු මෝදර විරෝධතාවයේ සංවිධායකවරු දේශපාලනය එපා කියන එක ප්‍රවර්ධනය කරන ගමන්ම ඇත්ත වශයෙන්ම උන් ඉදිරිපත් කරන්නේ ධනේශ්වර පාර්ලිමේන්තු විපක්ෂයට. ඒ කියන්නේ සමගි ජන බලවේගයට හා ජවිපෙට සමාන දේශපාලනයක්. මේ පක්ෂ විකල්ප ධනපති ආණ්ඩුවක් බලයට ගෙන ඒම පිණිස ආණ්ඩුවට එරෙහි මහජන වෛරය ගසා කෑමේ යෙදීගෙන ඉන්නවා. ඒ වගේ ආණ්ඩුවක් වැඩ කරන ජනතාව මුණ දෙන එකදු දෙවන ප්‍රශ්නයක්වත් විසඳීමට කටයුතු නොකරනවා විතරක් නෙවෙයි ඒව තවත් දරුණු කරනවා ඇති. ගෝලීය මූල්‍ය ප්‍රාග්ධනයේ සමාවිරහිත ඉල්ලීම්වර සැර බාල වෙනව නෙවෙයි ආසන්න අනාගතයේදී ඒව තවදුරටත් උස්සන්න කරනවා ඇති. සමාජවාදී සමානතා පක්ෂය ස්වාධීන කම්පරුපන්තික විප්ලවාදී සමාජවාදී ක්‍රියාමාර්ගයක් හා ඉදිරි දර්ශනයක් ඉදිරිපත් කරමින් මේ මහජන ව්‍යාපාරයේ ඇතුළත ක්‍රියාකාරීව මැදිහත් වෙනවා. අප්‍රේල් 7 වෙනිදා නිකුත් කළ අපේ ප්‍රකාශය විස්තරණය කළ තියෙන පරිදි සසප ගෝඨ යා යුතුය යනුවෙන් වැඩ කරන ජනයා කරන ඉල්ලීම් සමග එකට සිට ගනිමින් මෙලෙස ප්‍රශ්නය මතු කරනවා. පුරා දැක්වීම එහෙත් ඔහුව විස්ථාපනය කරන්නේ කුමකින්ද? රාජපක්ෂව ඉවත් කිරීම ඉල්ලා සිටීම පමණක් ප්‍රමාණවත් නැත. එමෙන්ම වර්තමාන දේශපාලන අර්බුදයේ විසඳීමේ මූලික පියවරක් ලෙස දරුණු ඒකාපති බලතල සහිතව කම්පරු පන්තියේ ඔළුවට තුවක්කුව මානාගෙන සිටින ජනාධිපති දුරය වහාවම අහෝසි කළ යුතුයයි සසප ඉල්ලා සිටි. පුටා ගැනීම අවසන්. සසප කම්පරු පන්තියට යෝජනා කරනවා සමාජවාදී ප්‍රතිපත්තිවලට කැපවෙන කම්කරු ගොයු ආණ්ඩුවක් ගොඩනැගීමට සටන් කරන ලෙස. එවන් ආණ්ඩුවක් ගොඩනගනව ඇත්තේ කම්පරු පන්තියේ ස්වාධීන බල සංස්ථා හරහායි. අපි වැඩ කරන ජනයාට යෝජනා කරනවා කම්පරුවන්ට එරෙහිව ආණ්ඩුවේ හා හාම්පුතුන්ගේ කාර්මික පොලිසියක් විදියට ක්‍රියා කරන වෘත්ති සමිති වලින් බිඳිලා හැම කම්හලකම වැඩපොලකම වතුආයකම නිවන් ප්‍රදේශයක තමන්ගේම ක්‍රියාකාරී කමිටු හදාගන්න කියලා. අප්‍රේල් 7 වෙනිදා සසප ප්‍රකාශය මහජනයාගේ දැවෙන අවශ්‍යතාවයන්ට ආමන්ත්‍රණය කිරීම සඳහා වන ක්‍රියාකාරී කමිටු වැඩකටයුතු වලට ජීවය සැපීම පිණිස ක්‍රියා මාර්ගයක් හා පිළිවෙත් යෝජනා කරනවා. සුළු ගොවීන්ගේ, දීවරයන්ගේ, මෙන්ම කුඩා කර්මාන්තකරුවන්ගේ හා සුළු ව්‍යාපාරිකයන්ගේ ණය අහෝසි කිරීම, මහජන ජීවිතවලට තීරණාත්මක වන සියලු අත්‍යවශ්‍ය භාණ්ඩ හා අනෙකුත් සම්පත් නිෂ්පාදනය හා බෙදා හැරීම, කම්පරුවන්ගේ ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදී පාලනයට නතු කිරීම, බැංකු මහා සංගත වතු හා අනෙකුත් ප්‍රධාන ආර්ථික මර්මස්ථාන ජනසුතු කිරීම, සියලු විදේශ ණය ප්‍රතික්ෂේප කිරීම සහ ජාත්‍යන්තර මූල්‍ය අරමුදලේ සහ ලෝක බැංකුවේ කප්පාදු නියෝග ප්‍රතික්ෂේප කිරීම ඒවට ඇතුළත් වෙනවා. දුගී ගොවියන් හා සෙසු පීඩිත ජනයා රැලි කරගනිමින් සමාජවාදී පිළිවෙත් මත පාදක වුණු කම්පරු ගෝ ආණ්ඩුවක් සඳහා ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ කම්පරු පන්තිය ගෙන යන සටන දකුණු ආසියාවේ සහ ජාත්‍යන්තරව සමාජවාදය සඳහා ගෙන යන වඩා පුළුල් අරගලයක කොටසක්. ඒක දකුණු ආසියාවේ හා ගෝලීයව වාසය කරන ඔවුන්ගේ පන්ති සහෝදර සහෝදරියන් සමග එකමුතු වෙලා ගෙන යන්න ඕන අරගලයක්. දකුණු ආසියාව තුල හතරවන ජාත්‍යන්තර කමිටුව ගොඩනගමු. සහෝදරුන්ට ස්තුතියි.
Thank you, Comrade Jayasekara. The second speaker from Sri Lanka, speaking in Tamil, will be Comrade M. Tevaraja. Tevaraja is a member of the political committee of the SCP in Sri Lanka. He plays a central role in the party's fight to establish rank-and-file committees at workplaces and in neighborhoods. At the beginning of April, he led a strike of tea plantation workers calling for the overthrow of the Rajapaksa government and its replacement with the government of workers and peasants. The Sri Lankan bourgeoisie stripped the Tamil-speaking plantation workers of their citizenship rights during formal independence in 1948. Now it is resorting once again to the poison of Sinhala chauvinism to divide Sinhala, Tamil and Muslim workers along ethnic lines. Our comrades in Sri Lanka have a powerful record in rejecting all forms of nationalism and communalism, which is essential in establishing the unity of the working class in Sri Lanka and internationally. A warm welcome to Comrade Tevaraja.
தோழர்களே, நண்பர்களே, 2020ஆம் ஆண்டின் தொடக்கத்தில் 4ஆம் அகிலத்தின் அனைத்துலக குழு உலக சோசலிச வலைத்தளத்தில் ஜனவரி 3, 2020 அன்று வெளியிட்ட புத்தாண்டு அறிக்கையின் மூலம் இந்த தசாப்தத்தை தீவிரமடைந்து வரும் வர்க்க போராட்டத்தினதும் உலக சோசலிச புரட்சியினது தசாப்தம் என்று வகைப்படுத்தியது. அதற்கு பின்னேறான முன்னேற்றங்கள் இந்த முன்கணிப்பை சக்தி வாய்ந்த முறையில் நிரூபித்துள்ளன. உலகளாவிய அரசியல், பொருளாதாரம் மற்றும் சமூக பிரச்சனைகளை ஒரு வரலாற்று மற்றும் சர்வதேச சூழலில் வைத்து மேற்கொண்ட ஒரு மார்க்சிச புறநிலை பகுப்பாய்வு மூலம் இந்த முன்கணிப்பை எங்களால் செய்ய முடிந்தது. உலகளவில் வர்க்க போராட்டத்தினுடைய வளர்ச்சியானது கோவிட்-19 தொற்று நோயால் 2020 ஆண்டு மத்தியில் தற்காலிகமாக பின்னடைவை சந்தித்தது. ஆனாலும் வாகனம், சுகாதாரம், கல்வி, மின்சாரம், போக்குவரத்து, சுரங்கத் தொழில், வங்கி போன்ற பல்வேறு துறைகளைச் சேர்ந்த தொழிலாளர்கள் தெற்காசியா உட்பட அமெரிக்கா, ஐரோப்பா மற்றும் ஆசிய பசிபிக் நாடுகளில் 2020 ஆண்டின் பிற்பகுதியில் தொடங்கி வேலைநிறுத்தங்கள் மற்றும் ஆர்ப்பாட்டங்கள் உட்பட போராட்டங்களில் ஈடுபட்டனர். அவர்கள் ஊதிய அதிகரிப்பு, சிறந்த வேலை நிலைமைகள், வேலை பாதுகாப்பு, தொற்று நோய்களின் கீழ் ஆபத்தான நிலைமைகளின் கீழ் இருந்து பாதுகாப்பு உட்பட தொடர் கோரிக்கைகளை முன்வைத்து போராடினர். உலக முதலாளித்துவத்தின் பிரமாண்டமான பொருளாதார, அரசியல் மற்றும் சமூக நெருக்கடியானது கோவிட்-19 தொற்று நோயினால் ரஷ்யாவுக்கு எதிரான அமெரிக்கா நேட்டோ பினாமி போரினாலும் மிகவும் தீவிரமடைந்துள்ளது. இது தொழிலாளர்கள், இளைஞர்கள் மற்றும் ஒடுக்கப்பட்ட வெகுஜனங்களை சர்வதேச அளவில் வேலைநிறுத்தங்கள் மற்றும் எதிர்ப்புகள் உட்பட தொடர் போராட்டங்களில் இறங்க நிர்பந்தித்துள்ளது. இந்த உலகளாவிய வளர்ச்சியின் வெளிப்பாட்டை தெற்காசியாவில் வர்க்கம் மற்றும் சமூக போராட்டங்களிலும் நாம் காண்கின்றோம். குறிப்பாக இலங்கையில் ஜனாதிபதி கோட்டபய ராஜபக்சவின் அரசாங்கத்துக்கு எதிரான தற்போதைய மக்கள் எழுச்சியிலும் இதை நாம் காண்கின்றோம். இப்போது இந்த அரசாங்க எதிர்ப்பு வெகுஜன இயக்கத்தின் வளர்ச்சியில் ஒரு முக்கியமான திருப்புமுனையை குறிக்கும் வகையில் தொழிலாளி வர்க்கம் ஒரு ஒழுங்கமைக்கப்பட்ட வர்க்கமாக போராட்டங்களில் நுழையத் தொடங்கியுள்ளது. ஏப்ரல் 28 பொது வேலைநிறுத்தத்தில் அரசாங்க ஊழியர்கள், தனியார் மற்றும் அரசு ஊழியர்கள் மற்றும் மிகவும் முக்கியமாக பெருந்தொழில் தொழிலாளர்களுமாக அனைத்து துறைகளை சேர்ந்த மில்லியன் கணக்கான தொழிலாளர்கள் பங்கு பெற்றியமை அதற்கான தெளிவான அறிகுறியாகும். பிரமாண்டமான எண்ணிக்கையின் காரணமாக மட்டுமன்றி தொழிலாளி வர்க்கம் ஒரு வர்க்கமாக அரசாங்கம் ராஜினாமா செய்ய வேண்டும் என்ற ஒரு வெளிப்படையான அரசியல் கோரிக்கையின் அடிப்படையில் வீதிகளில் இறங்கி இருப்பதால் இது முன் எப்போதும் இல்லாத ஒரு நிலைமையாகும். ஜனாதிபதியையும் அவரது அரசாங்கத்தை ராஜினாமா செய்ய கோரி வளர்ந்து வரும் வெகுஜன போராட்டங்களில் தொழிலாளி வர்க்கத்தின் எந்த ஒரு சுயாதீன தலையீட்டையும் தடுத்து வைத்துள்ள தொழிற்சங்கங்கள் இந்த இயக்கத்தில் சேருவதற்கு தங்கள் உறுப்பினர்கள் மத்தியில் எழுந்த பெரும் அழுத்தம் காரணமாக வேலைநிறுத்தத்திற்கு அழைப்பு விடுக்க நிர்பந்திக்கப்பட்டன. இவ்வாறாயினும் தொழிற்சங்கங்களின் நோக்கம் தொழிலாளி வர்க்கத்தினுள் வளர்ந்து வரும் எதிர்ப்பை கட்டுப்படுத்தி அதை இடைக்கால அரசாங்கம் என்ற பொறிக்குள் அரசியல் ரீதியாக முடிச்சு போட்டு வெகுஜன இயக்கத்தை முதலாளித்துவ ஆட்சிக்குள்ளே வைத்திருப்பதாகும். முதலாளித்துவ பாராளுமன்ற எதிர்க்கட்சியான ஐக்கிய மக்கள் சக்தி மற்றும் ஜேவிபியுமே இந்த இடைக்கால அரசாங்கம் என்பதை முன்னிலைப்படுத்தி வருகின்றன. சோசலிச சமத்துவ கட்சியானது தற்போதைய வெகுஜன இயக்கத்தில் தொடர்ச்சியாக அரசியல் ரீதியாக தலையிட்டு வருகின்றது. அதன் ஒரு முக்கியமான படியாக ஏப்ரல் 28 பொது வேலைநிறுத்தத்தில் அது ஒரு முன்னோக்கை தொழிலாளி வர்க்க சுயாதீனமான புரட்சிகர வேலை திட்டம் மற்றும் முன்னோக்கை பரிந்துரை செய்து சக்தி வாய்ந்த முறையில் தலையிட்டது. சோசலிச சமத்துவ கட்சி தீவின் பல பகுதிகளிலும் வேலைநிறுத்தம் செய்யும் தொழிலாளர்கள் மத்தியில் கட்சியின் அறிக்கையின் ஆயிரக்கணக்கான பிரதிகளை விநியோகித்து அந்த அறிக்கை தொழிலாளி வர்க்கத்திற்கான அதன் செயல் திட்டத்தை தெளிவுபடுத்தி காட்டுகிறது. எதேச்சதிகார நிறைவேற்று ஜனாதிபதி முறை ஒழிக்கப்பட வேண்டும் மற்றும் அனைத்து அடக்குமுறை சட்டங்களும் நீக்கப்பட வேண்டும் என்று எங்களது அறிக்கை அழைப்பு விடுத்துள்ளது. ராஜபக்ச அரசாங்கமும் எதிர்க்கட்சிகளும் முன்னெடுத்து செல்ல முயலும் சர்வதேச நாணய நிதியத்தின் சிக்கன திட்டத்துக்கு எதிராக பெரு வணிகத்தின் லாபங்களை விட உழைக்கும் மக்களின் அடிப்படை சமூக தேவைகளுக்கு முன்னுரிமை கொடுக்கின்ற ஒரு சோசலிச வேலை திட்டத்தை நாங்கள் முன்வைக்கிறோம் என்ற இந்த அறிக்கை விளக்குகிறது. வெகுஜன எதிர்ப்புகளுக்கு எதிராக ராஜபக்ச அரசாங்கத்துக்கு முன் கொடுப்பதில் தமிழ் முதலாளித்துவ கட்சிகள் குறிப்பாக பிற்போக்கு பாத்திரம் ஆற்றுகின்றன. பிரதான பாராளுமன்ற கட்சியான தமிழ் தேசிய கூட்டமைப்பு மற்றும் அதனுடன் இணைந்த தமிழ் தேசியவாத குழுக்களும் பல வாரங்களாக வளர்ந்து வரும் வெகுஜன எதிர்ப்பு குறித்து காதுகளாதவர் போல் மௌனத்தை கடைப்பிடித்தன. இறுதியாக ஏப்ரல் 13 அன்று கூட்டமைப்பு தலைவர் எம்.ஏ. சுமந்திரன் மௌனத்தை கலைத்தார். ராஜபக்ச அரசாங்கத்தின் தலைவர்களுடனும் முன்னாள் ஜனாதிபதிகளான மைத்திரிபால சிறிசேனா, சந்திரிகா குமாரதுங்க, பிரதமர் மஹிந்த ராஜபக்ச உட்பட கொழும்பு முதலாளித்துவ ஸ்தாபனத்தில் உள்ள வேறு சில அரசியல்வாதிகளுடன் தொழிலாளர்கள் மற்றும் தமிழ் மக்களின் முதுகுக்கு பின்னால் பேச்சுவார்த்தை நடத்தியதாக அவர் பெருமை அடித்து கொண்டார். அரசியல் சூழ்நிலையில் ஸ்திரத்தன்மையை கொண்டு வர முயற்சிக்கும் பல பேச்சுவார்த்தைகளில் நான் ஈடுபட்டேன் என்று சுமந்திரன் ஒப்புக்கொண்டார். கூட்டமைப்பின் தலைவர் அரசாங்கத்துடனும் மற்றும் முதலாளித்துவ தலைவர்களுடனும் முதலாளித்துவ ஆட்சிக்கு அரசியல் ஸ்திரத்தன்மையை கொண்டு வந்து எதிர்ப்புகளை முடிவுக்கு கொண்டு வர சதி செய்து வருகிறார். அப்போது ஏதாவது ஒரு இடைக்கால அரசாங்கமும் சர்வதேச நாணய நிதியமும் ஆணையிட்டுள்ள சிக்கன நடவடிக்கைகளையே அமுல்படுத்த முடியும். ராஜபக்ச அரசாங்கத்துடனான தமிழ் கூட்டமைப்பின் இந்த துரோக ஒத்துழைப்பு ஆர்ப்பாட்டக்காரர்கள் மீது கொடூரமான ஒடுக்குமுறைகளை தயாரிக்க அதன் கரங்களை பலப்படுத்தியுள்ளது. சுமந்திரனின் கருத்து தெரிவித்த பின்னர் 6 நாட்களுக்குள் ரம்புக்கணையில் எரிபொருள் விலை உயர்வை கண்டித்து ஆர்ப்பாட்டத்தில் ஈடுபட்ட ஆயிரக்கணக்கான மக்கள் மீது போலீசார் நடத்திய கொடூரமான துப்பாக்கிச் சூட்டில் சமிந்த லக்ஷான் என்ற தொழிலாளி கொல்லப்பட்டதோடு டசின் கணக்கானவர்கள் காயமடைந்தனர். தற்போது நடந்து வரும் மக்கள் எழுச்சியில் பெருந்தொற்று தொழிலாளர்கள் அதிக அளவில் தலையிட்டு வருகின்றனர். ஏப்ரல் 22, 28 பொது வேலைநிறுத்தத்தின் போது மலையக தோட்ட மாவட்டங்களில் உற்பத்தி முற்றாக மூடப்பட்டது. தொழிலாளர்களின் நடவடிக்கைக்கு ஆதரவாக ஹட்டன் மற்றும் கொட்டகல, மஸ்கேலியா போன்ற பல நகரங்களில் கடைகள் அடைக்கப்பட்டதுடன் வேலைநிறுத்தத்தில் ஈடுபட்ட தொழிலாளர்கள் ஆர்ப்பாட்டக்காரர்களை நடத்தி நகரங்களை மக்கள் வெள்ளத்தில் மூழ்கடித்தனர். ஒரு அரசியல் கட்சியாகவும் செயற்படும் பிரதான தோட்ட தொழிற்சங்கமான இலங்கை தொழிலாளர் காங்கிரஸ் அரசாங்கத்தின் பங்காளியாக இருந்து கொண்டு தொழிலாளி வர்க்கத்தின் சமூக மற்றும் ஜனநாயக உரிமைகள் மீதான அரசாங்கத்தின் தாக்குதலுக்கு தீவிரமாக ஆதரவளித்து வருகின்றனர். பல வாரங்களாக அரசாங்கத்துக்கு எதிரான மக்கள் போராட்டங்களை நடத்துவது பற்றி ஒரு மௌனம் சாதித்து இலங்கை தொழிலாளர் காங்கிரஸ் இப்போது அதிகரித்து வரும் தொழிலாளர்களின் எதிர்ப்பை முகம் கொடுத்து பாராளுமன்றத்தில் ஒரு சுயாதீன குழுவாக செயல்பட போவதாக அறிவித்துள்ளதுடன் பிரதான எதிர்க்கட்சியான ஐக்கிய மக்கள் சக்தி தயாரித்த நம்பிக்கையில்லா பிரேரணை ஆதரிக்க உள்ளது. இதன் மூலம் இலங்கை தொழிலாளர் காங்கிரஸின் நடவடிக்கைக்கும் தொழிலாளர் எதிர்கொள்ளும் தாங்க முடியாத நிலைமைகள் பற்றிய கவலைகளுக்கும் எந்த சம்பந்தமும் கிடையாது. மாறாக அவர்கள் வளர்ந்து வரும் எதிர்ப்பை ஒரு மாற்று முதலாளித்துவ அரசாங்கத்தை அமைப்பதற்கு முதலாளித்துவ எதிர்க்கட்சிகள் மேற்கொள்ளும் முயற்சிகளுக்குள் கரைத்து விடுவதை இலக்காக கொண்டுள்ளது. இது அதே சர்வதேச நாணய நிதியத்தின் சிக்கன கொள்கைகளை மட்டுமே அமுல்படுத்த முடியும். ஐக்கிய மக்கள் சக்தி, ஜேவிபி, தமிழ் கூட்டமைப்பு மற்றும் அவர்களின் போலி இடது கைத்தேங்காய்கள் மற்றும் தொழிற்சங்கங்கள் உட்பட முதலாளித்துவ அரசியல் ஸ்தாபனத்தின் அனைத்து கட்சிகளுக்கும் எதிராக சோசலிச சமத்துவ கட்சி ஏழை விவசாயிகள் மற்றும் பிற ஒடுக்கப்பட்ட மக்களை ஒன்றிணைக்கும் ஒரு சுயாதீனமான அரசியல் இயக்கத்தில் தொழிலாளி வர்க்கத்தை அணிதிரட்ட போராடுகிறது. அதன் மூலம் ராஜபக்ச அரசாங்கத்தை தூக்கி வீசி இடைக்கால அரசாங்கத்தை அனுமதிக்காமல் சோசலிச கொள்கைகளுக்கு அர்ப்பணித்து கொண்ட தொழிலாளர் மற்றும் விவசாயிகள் அரசாங்கத்தை ஸ்தாபிக்க சோசலிச சமத்துவ கட்சி போராடுகின்றது. அதற்காக அரசாங்கம் மற்றும் முதலாளிகளுக்கு தொழில்துறையின் போலீஸ் படைகளாக செயல்படும் தொழிற்சங்கங்கள் அனைத்தில் இருந்தும் பிரிந்து தொழிலாளர்கள் தங்கள் சொந்த நடவடிக்கை குழுவை உருவாக்க வேண்டும். பெருந்தோட்டம், சுகாதாரம், கல்வி மற்றும் கலை போன்ற பல்வேறு துறைகளில் இந்த நடவடிக்கை குழுக்களை அமைப்பதில் முன்முயற்சி எடுத்துள்ள சோசலிச சமத்துவ கட்சி அத்தகைய குழுக்களை அமைப்பதற்கு தொழிலாளருக்கு அனைத்து அரசியல் உதவிகளையும் வழங்க தயாராக உள்ளது. எமது நடவடிக்கை குழுக்களின் ஊடாக தோட்ட தொழிலாளர்களுக்கு அவர்களின் வரலாற்று பணிகள் குறித்து விழிப்புணர்வு ஏற்படுத்தவும் அபிவிருத்தி அடைந்து வரும் போராட்டங்களில் அவர்களின் முன்னணி பாத்திரத்தை அவர்களுக்கு உணர்த்தவும் நாங்கள் போராடி வருகின்றோம். தொழிலாளர்கள் மற்றும் விவசாயிகள் அரசாங்கத்தை ஸ்தாபிப்புக்கான அதன் போராட்டத்தில் இலங்கை தொழிலாளர் வர்க்கமானது குறிப்பாக இந்தியா உட்பட தெற்காசியாவிலும் மற்றும் உலகம் முழுதுமுள்ள உலக சோசலிச புரட்சிக்கான சர்வதேச தொழிலாளி வர்க்கத்தின் ஐக்கியப்பட்ட இயக்கத்தில் உலகங்களிலும் உள்ள தங்கள் வர்க்க சகோதர சகோதரிகளுடன் ஐக்கியத்தை கட்டியெழுப்ப வேண்டும். நன்றி.
Thank you, Comrade Tevaraja. From Sri Lanka, we are now turning to Europe. The continent is literally being turned into a launching pad for war against Russia by the imperialist powers. The first speaker from Europe will be Comrade Christoph van Dreyer. He is the National Secretary of the Sozialistische Gleichheitspartei in Germany and the author of the book Why Are They Back? Historical Falsification, Political Conspiracy and the Return of Fascism in Germany. He will address this rally from Berlin. The German ruling class is playing a particularly sinister role in the Ukraine war. 80 years after the war of annihilation against the Soviet Union, Germany is sending heavy weapons and tanks for war against Russia. The SGP is the only party in Germany denouncing this and giving expression to the deep-rooted anti-militarism in the German working class. Welcome, Comrade Christoph.
Ich freue mich sehr, an diesem historischen May Day teilnehmen zu können und sende die revolutionären Grüße der Sozialistischen Gleichheitspartei. Auch hier in Deutschland spitzt sich der Klassenkampf rasant zu. Täglich sterben hunderte Menschen völlig vermeidbar an Covid-19, weil die Regierung die unmittelbarsten Profitinteressen vor das Leben und die Gesundheit der Menschen stellt. Eine Inflation bei Lebensmitteln von 20 bis 50% und horrende Energiekosten dezimieren die Löhne und steigern die Wut der Arbeiter. Für welche Freiheit soll ich frieren, fragt uns ein Arbeiter vor dem Supermarkt. Für die Freiheit, immer länger zu arbeiten, für immer weniger Lohn? Je deutlicher der Charakter eines Stellvertreterkriegs in der Ukraine sichtbar wird und die Gefahr eines dritten Weltkriegs wächst, deshalb größer ist die Ablehnung in der Arbeiterklasse. Nach 2 Weltkriegen und den schlimmsten Verbrechen der Menschheitsgeschichte ist der Antimilitarismus unter Arbeitern in Deutschland tief verwurzelt. Doch die Bundesregierung knüpft erneut an ihre schrecklichen Traditionen an und rüstet für den Dritten Weltkrieg. 81 Jahre nach dem Überfall auf die Sowjetunion rollen deutsche Panzer wieder gegen Russland. Nachdem bereits Panzer aus ehemaligen NVA-Beständen in die Ukraine geliefert wurden, bereiten sich die Rüstungskonzerne Rheinmetall und Krauss-Maffei darauf vor, moderne Schützenpanzer, Kampfpanzer und Flugabwehrpanzer zu liefern, finanziert durch die Bundesregierung. Beide Unternehmen hatten schon die Panzer für Hitlers Wehrmacht gebaut und dabei Zehntausende Zwangsarbeiter und KZ-Insassen ausgebeutet und vernichtet. Diese Kriegsmaschinerie wird jetzt wieder gegen Russland in Gang gesetzt. Die Waffenlieferungen an die Ukraine sind erst der Anfang. Nur 3 Tage nach Beginn der russischen Invasion rief Bundeskanzler Olaf Scholz die Zeitenwende aus und kündigte die Verdreifachung des deutschen Kriegsetats an. Damit gibt Deutschland in diesem Jahr deutlich mehr Geld für Rüstung aus als jedes andere europäische Land, einschließlich Russlands. Es will erneut die mächtigste Militärmacht und Zuchtmeister Europas werden, wie es der Richter Humboldt-Professor Herfried Münkler schon 2014 forderte. Für diese horrenden Aufrüstungspläne bot der Ukraine-Krieg nur den Vorwand. Ausgearbeitet wurden sie schon im letzten Herbst, als SPD, Grüne und FDP ihren Koalitionsvertrag aushandelten. Befeuert wird die Jahrhundertaufrüstung mit einer ohrenbetäubenden Kriegspropaganda auf allen Kanälen. Zeitungen und Fernsehsendungen überbieten sich mit unbewiesener Gräuelpropaganda und kochen den alten antirussischen Chauvinismus und blanken Rassismus wieder hoch. Alle Russen sind Feinde, titelte etwa die Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Der Spiegel veröffentlichte eine seitenlange pseudohistorische Abhandlung darüber, weshalb bei den Russen die Bestialität seit Jahrhunderten System habe, insbesondere im Zweiten Weltkrieg. Während Russen als Ausgeburt des Bösen dargestellt werden, werden die Verbrechen des deutschen Imperialismus systematisch verharmlost und relativiert. So wird die russische Invasion in der Ukraine mittlerweile von Politik und Medien routinemäßig als Vernichtungskrieg bezeichnet. Ein Begriff, der bisher vor allem für den Krieg der Nazis gegen die Sowjetunion verwendet wurde. Der verwendet wurde für die bis ins Detail geplante Vernichtung von 27 Millionen Sowjetbürgern. Diese bestialische Mordmaschinerie wird jetzt mit einem Krieg gleichgesetzt, der nicht ansatzweise einen solchen Charakter trägt. Schon als die Bundesregierung 2014 den rechten Putsch in der Ukraine unterstützte und das Ende der militärischen Zurückhaltung Deutschlands verkündete, wurde das mit einer Rehabilitierung der Wehrmacht und der Verharmlosung Hitlers medial flankiert. Im Spiegel erklärte der rechtsradikale Professor Jörg Barbarowski, dass Hitler nicht grausam und der Holocaust auch nichts anderes gewesen sei als Erschießungen im russischen Bürgerkrieg. Als die IYSSI und die SGP dieser bodenlosen Geschichtsfälschung entgegentraten, wurde Barbarowski von Vertretern sämtlicher Bundestagsparteien und fast allen Medien verteidigt und gefeiert. Jetzt zeigt sich in aller Schärfe, dass es hier nicht um einen einzelnen Professor ging, sondern um die Grundtendenz des deutschen Imperialismus. Die historischen Verbrechen des deutschen Militarismus müssen verharmlost werden, um neue Verbrechen vorzubereiten. In der vergangenen Woche ging ein Kommentar im Spiegel diesen Weg konsequent zu Ende und forderte, die Geschichte zu vergessen um Deutschland endlich mit Atomwaffen ausrüsten zu können. Diese wahnsinnige Politik eines nuklearen Weltkriegs richtet sich zunächst gegen Russland, bringt aber all die historischen Grundfragen des deutschen Imperialismus zurück und verschärft auch die Spannungen mit Frankreich, Großbritannien und den USA. Sie wird von sämtlichen Bundestagsparteien unterstützt. Die schlimmsten Kriegstreiber sind dabei die Grünen. Es vergeht kein Tag, an dem nicht ein Vertreter der Partei mit Schaum vor dem Mund für weitere und schwerere Waffenlieferungen und eine noch größere Aufrüstung trommeln würde. Der langjährige Chef der Grünen Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung in Kiew, Sergei Somleny, forderte sogar einen Atomkrieg gegen Russland, um dessen Bedrohungspotenzial zu zerstören. Auch die Linkspartei ist Teil der Kriegsverschwörung. Als Scholz seine Zeitenwende verkündete, schloss sich die Fraktion dem Regierungsantrag weitgehend an. Der außenpolitische Sprecher der Fraktion, Gregor Gysi, wollte sogar dem 100 Milliarden Aufrüstungsprogramm der Bundesregierung zustimmen. Der vollständige Bankrott der kleinbürgerlichen Pazifisten kommt dabei nicht überraschend. Sie waren so lange für militärische Zurückhaltung eingetreten, wie dies im Interesse des deutschen Imperialismus lag. Heute stehen sie mit wehenden Fahnen im Kriegslager. Die Sozialistische Gleichheitspartei ist die einzige Partei, die sich dem deutschen Militarismus entgegenstellt. Wir geben dem tief verwurzelten Antimilitarismus unter Arbeitern eine Stimme und eine sozialistische Perspektive. Deshalb geht die herrschende Klasse Deutschlands mit allen Mitteln gegen uns vor. Nachdem sie eine regelrechte Hetzkampagne gegen uns in den großen Medien führte, uns Google und Facebook zensierten, setzt uns der Verfassungsschutz auf die Liste extremistischer Organisationen. Allein das Streiten für eine demokratische, egalitäre und sozialistische Gesellschaft und der Kampf gegen Imperialismus wird von der Bundesregierung für verfassungsfeindlich erklärt. Sie tun das nicht aus einer Position der Stärke, sondern der Schwäche. Sie tun es, weil ihre unaufhörliche Kriegspropaganda, eingedenk der historischen Erfahrungen in diesem Land, in der arbeitenden Bevölkerung nicht verfängt. Zusammen mit unseren Genossen des Internationalen Komitees der 4. Internationale schlugen wir die Zensur unseres Antikriegsvideos durch Facebook zurück. Und genauso werden wir die Versuche des Staats zurückschlagen, uns zu kriminalisieren. Denn unsere Partei, das IKVI, repräsentiert etwas, das sehr viel stärker ist als der Staatsapparat mit all seiner Kriegsmaschinerie. Die Einheit der internationalen Arbeiterklasse. Es hängt jetzt alles davon ab, die wachsende Opposition der Arbeiterklasse gegen Krieg und Ungleichheit in eine bewusste politische Kraft zu verwandeln und das IKVI als Weltpartei der sozialistischen Revolution in jedem Land der Welt aufzubauen.
Thanks, Comrade Christoph, for this powerful indictment of German imperialism. There's a real competition between the imperialist powers in Europe as to who will supply the most weapons to Ukraine and escalate the offensive against Russia most aggressively. Also, Great Britain is certainly at the forefront of this. I'm very pleased to announce as our next speaker, Comrade Chris Marston. Comrade Chris is the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party in Britain. He will address this rally from Sheffield. Greetings, Comrade Chris.
No country is more desperate to be in the front rank of the imperialist war drive against Russia than the UK. At the beginning of April, Prime Minister Boris Johnson made sure he was the first NATO leader to visit Kiev, where he combined jibes against Germany with boasts of the vast array of weapons the UK had provided Ukraine. Speaking alongside President Zelensky, he said Britain had raised weapons and equipment for Ukraine worth over £1.5 billion. 1 week later, it was confirmed that SAS personnel are training Ukrainian soldiers on ground in the use of 3,600 UK-supplied anti-tank weapons. Since the Maidan coup of 2014, tens of thousands in Ukraine's army have been trained by Britain, which has led war games involving Ukraine in the Black Sea and elsewhere. UK politicians are foremost in turning up the heat. This week, Defence Minister James Heappey threatened it is entirely legitimate to go after targets on Russian soil. This prompted the servile BBC to comment, "The line between defending Ukraine and attacking Russia is increasingly blurred." Not blurred, obliterated. Russia warned, London's direct provocation of the Kiev regime into such actions will immediately lead to our proportional response. The Russian armed forces are in round-the-clock readiness to launch retaliatory strikes with high-precision, long-range weapons at decision-making centres in Kiev, stressing that this is where UK representatives were located. Major foreign policy issues dictate this agenda. The sun long ago set on the British Empire. Its decline has pushed it into the arms of Washington, hoping to leverage slavish warmongering to boost its world position against Germany, France and other rivals. Julian Assange faces extradition to the US for the same reason, with Home Secretary Priti Patel to render a predetermined verdict in May aimed at silencing the WikiLeaks founder for exposing the war crimes of Washington and London. But that is far from the whole picture. The turn to war is also animated by fear of a social explosion at home. The UK is a social and economic cesspit. A tiny layer of the global super-rich have gravitated to London as a haven for financial criminality and opulent living, while millions of working people eke out an ever more precarious existence. This month, every household in Britain was hit by a massive 54% rise in energy bills, to be followed by a similar hike in October. With inflation hovering at 10%, UK households face a staggering £2,620 increase on bills and other costs. People cannot live. The UK's most popular financial advisor, Martin Lewis, has warned, "We need to keep people fed. We need to keep them warm. If we get this wrong right now, then we get to the point where we start to risk civil unrest." The Sunday Times drew the same conclusion, asking in April 17, "Is Britain heading for the summer of discontent?" and warning, "There is a feeling that the balance of power, weighted in favour of management for decades, is beginning to shift." There is a potential strike wave brewing, with ballots by over 40,000 rail workers, 40,000 BT workers, university and school staff, and post office workers. As in every country, British workers face the challenge of building new organisations of class struggle and a new political leadership to take their fight to the employers. They have been reduced to dire straits because the trade unions and the Labour Party have collaborated with a decades-long offensive by Britain's rulers. In the trade unions, workers confront an enemy they are now openly beginning to take on, to end collusion with management in every workplace. They also need to be able to fight the high-level collusion of the trade unions and their political partner, the Labour Party, with the Conservative government. During the pandemic, the Trades Union Congress supported Johnson's handing billions to the major corporations and then enforced his return to work agenda. Labour, first under Jeremy Corbyn and then Sir Keir Starmer, pledged only constructive criticism to defend the national interest. Johnson's personal fate is now on the line over his attending illegal drinks parties during the UK's 2 lockdowns, and Starmer finally raises himself to his full height to demand his resignation. Not to reflect the hatred of millions for the man responsible for nearly 200,000 COVID deaths, who said they should continue to die in their thousands, and who unlawfully released infected NHS patients and transformed care homes into killing fields. Labour wants a Tory leader that can better impersonate Winston Churchill than the Eton-educated buffoon occupying number 10. Labour MP Chris Bryant warned in Parliament, "The Prime Minister may have to come to this House and say, we may have to consider offensive weaponry. We may have to consider British troops being put in a place of danger." In addition, he would have to tell British workers to make further sacrifices because the economy is in a very difficult place and the public finances are in a very difficult place. He continued, "At a moment of national and international crisis, we need a leader of completely and utterly unimpeachable moral authority. There is no such leader in Parliament's political gang of criminals, Starmer included. The British working class must mobilise its collective strength to defeat the Tories and Labour's shared agenda of austerity, mass infection and war. In so doing, they will take their proper place in the worldwide struggle for socialism to which this May Day rally is dedicated." Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. My name is Joseph Scalise. I'm a historian and writer for the World Socialist website. Leon Trotsky wrote in 1932 that a revolutionary program holds water only in the event that its text is tied up with the revolutionary experience of the party and with the lessons gained from the battles which have entered into the flesh and blood of its cadre. This requires the painstaking assimilation of the lessons of history. It requires study. Mering Books at mering.com is the publishing arm of the World Socialist website. It publishes books on history, economics, philosophy, culture, as well as contemporary politics and the struggles of the working class. Among the books available from Mering.com are the writings of David North, including The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century, a work that demonstrates that the fundamental problems of the 20th century remain unresolved, and the seminal event at their core is the October Revolution of 1917. The Heritage We Defend, an essential text written as a polemic that details the history of world Trotskyism. A Quarter Century of War, a work that is tragically but inescapably essential reading today as Washington has brought the world to the brink of World War III. Other works available from Mering include the 1619 Project and the Racialist Falsification of History. The works of Vadim Rogovin, Russian historian and sociologist, who details the struggles of the left opposition led by Leon Trotsky against the Stalinist betrayals of Marxism. And the writings of Vronsky, a wide-ranging and humane examination of a Marxist approach to art written by a leading left oppositionist. You can purchase all of these and a good many more from Mering.com. While you're there, sign up for Mering's newsletter so that you can remain informed about sales and upcoming publications. Forthcoming books from Mering include works on the pandemic, the coup and cover-up of January 6, and collections of writings on Trotsky. The working class must arm itself with the necessary historical and political lessons for its revolutionary struggle. We read to fight.
Our next speaker is Comrade Alex Londier. He is the National Secretary of the Parti de l'Égalité Socialiste, the Socialist Equality Party in France. Last Sunday, the second round of the French presidential elections took place. It left French workers and youth with the rotten choice between the president of the rich, Emmanuel Macron, and the neo-fascist candidate Marine Le Pen. The PES advanced a call for an active boycott. It thus gave expression to the massive opposition against both candidates, which is only growing after the unpopular victory of Macron. Please welcome from Paris, Comrade Alex Londier.
Chers camarades, chers amis, j'apporte les salutations fraternelles du Parti de l'Égalité Socialiste de France à cette fête internationale du travail. En France, comme ailleurs, les festivités du 1er mai se déroulent dans l'ombre de la guerre impérialiste livrée à la Russie en Ukraine par les puissances de l'OTAN. Un gouffre de classe sépare l'attitude des travailleurs envers la guerre de celle de l'élite dirigeante en France. Il n'y a aucun soutien pour l'invasion réactionnaire de l'Ukraine lancée par le régime capitaliste du président russe Vladimir Poutine. Mais l'offensive brutale de l'OTAN contre la Russie et la menace d'une escalade nucléaire inquiètent la vaste majorité des Français. Stopper la poussée de l'OTAN vers la guerre nécessitera la mobilisation internationale de la classe ouvrière en une lutte renouvelée pour le socialisme. Les élections présidentielles en France, qui viennent de s'achever ce 24 avril, ont montré qu'on ne peut pas lutter pour stopper la guerre par les urnes. Les deux candidats au second tour, le sortant libéral Emmanuel Macron et la néofasciste Marine Le Pen, ont tous deux escamoté le danger d'une guerre mondiale. Le Pen a tenté de faire oublier son hostilité envers l'islam et son soutien pour Donald Trump en affichant une certaine sollicitude envers Moscou. Elle a salué les discussions de Macron avec Poutine en les traitant d'initiatives pour la paix. Mais quel mensonge! Macron ne fait pas mieux qu'elle. Il a salué l'énorme rôle joué par la Russie et par toute l'Union soviétique dans la défaite des armées nazies et la libération de l'Europe du joug nazi pendant la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Et pour prétendre qu'une Europe assagie a appris les leçons de l'histoire, il a évoqué, contre l'invasion russe de l'Ukraine, le souvenir du massacre nazi à Oradour-sur-Glane, en France, pendant la libération. Mais en réalité, l'OTAN ne veut pas libérer, mais asservir les travailleurs. Macron s'aligne sur l'OTAN et sur Washington, qui assument sans complexe la volonté de casser les chines de la Russie. Biden a dit à la Business Roundtable, l'instance du patronat américain, que les hauts gradés du Pentagone envisagent à nouveau entre 45 et 60 millions de morts dans des guerres pour décider qui dirigera un nouvel ordre mondial. L'impérialisme français espère avoir sa part du butin dans une nouvelle redivision du monde. Paris livre donc des armes à l'armée et aux milices nationalistes d'extrême droite ukrainiennes qui tuent des soldats russes pour le compte de l'OTAN. Sous couvert de l'étiquette libérale de Macron, la bourgeoisie française poursuit une politique extérieure d'extrême droite. Quel est l'emblème du bataillon Azov, la milice néo-nazie ukrainienne qui est aux avant-postes de la guerre avec la Russie? C'est la Wolfsangel, l'emblème de la division SS nazie Das Reich, qui, venue en France depuis l'Ukraine occupée pendant la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, a commis le même massacre à Oradour. Le choix d'emblème du bataillon Azov, comme le silence dessus de Macron, n'est pas le fruit du hasard. Aujourd'hui, la référence de l'extrême droite ukrainienne, cette référence, c'est Stéphane Bandera, le chef de la collaboration ukrainienne avec l'occupation nazie de l'Ukraine pendant la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Et en 2018, Macron a fait savoir ses propres sympathies, alors qu'il envoyait les flics attaquer les gilets jaunes, qui étaient mobilisés contre ces politiques sociales anti-ouvrières, en saluant la mémoire du dictateur collaborationniste français, Philippe Pétain. Aux élections présidentielles, le Parti de l'égalité socialiste a appelé les travailleurs à boycotter le vote. Le PES récuse la politique du moindre mal qui ferait faussement passer Macron pour une alternative à l'extrême droite. Le PES a insisté que seul le rejet d'une élection frauduleuse entre deux candidats d'extrême droite préparerait les travailleurs aux luttes qu'il faudrait mener contre le prochain président. L'intervention du PES dans les présidentielles a révélé à nouveau l'importance de la défense du trotskisme menée par le Comité international de la 4e internationale. Rejetant la théorie nationaliste du socialisme en un seul pays mise en avant par Staline, tout comme les manœuvres nationales d'appareil menée par les staliniens français, le PES a mis en avant une ligne socialiste et internationaliste contre la guerre et contre le danger d'une dictature fascisante. Au premier tour de l'élection présidentielle le 10 avril, 22% des électeurs ont tenté de faire entendre une opposition de gauche en votant pour Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Arrivé juste derrière les 23% de Marine Le Pen, Mélenchon était certes éliminé. Mais son vote, concentré parmi les jeunes et parmi les travailleurs dans les quartiers ouvriers des grandes villes, ce vote mettait Mélenchon et son parti, la France Insoumise, dans une position puissante. Le PES a proposé une politique active de lutte pour la classe ouvrière. Mélenchon aurait pu appeler ses électeurs à faire grève et à manifester contre la guerre et contre le second tour Macron-Le Pen. De telles mobilisations dans les quartiers ouvriers des principales villes de France auraient pu non seulement mettre l'économie française à l'arrêt, mais aussi rallier les travailleurs à l'international dans une lutte contre la guerre. Mais Mélenchon a réagi en tentant de démobiliser ses propres électeurs. Il a appelé à un vote LFI aux élections législatives en juin, promettant de servir de Premier ministre à une présidence soit de Macron, soit de Le Pen. C'est un signe que le milieu stalinien et social-démocrate autour des dirigeants de LFI pourrait très bien s'accommoder d'un régime néofasciste en France qui ferait la guerre à la Russie. En effet, avant la présidentielle, tous les appareils petits bourgeois qui, au XXe siècle, dominaient la gauche et le mouvement ouvrier en France, en mettant en avant leur amitié pour la bureaucratie soviétique, ils se sont tous retournés contre la Russie. Le syndicat stalinien CGT, le nouveau parti anticapitaliste Pabliste, et aussi Mélenchon lui-même ont témoigné de leur sympathie pour l'OTAN contre la Russie en Ukraine. La déclaration de Mélenchon qu'il servirait de Premier ministre sous n'importe quel président de France, tout comme l'alignement des anciens appareils pro-staliniens sur l'OTAN et contre la Russie, tout cela constitue un avertissement. Les descendants politiques petits bourgeois des opposants pro-staliniens du trotskisme évoluent rapidement vers la droite. Par contre, le PES a pleinement confiance dans les capacités révolutionnaires du prolétariat français et international. Un gouffre de classe sépare les travailleurs des diverses forces politiques de la pseudo-gauche. Mais les travailleurs, armés d'une perspective et des traditions de la révolution d'octobre 1917 en Russie, pourront lutter et avoir raison du capitalisme et de la guerre, et ainsi bâtir le socialisme. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Comrade Alex. Our next speaker will be Comrade Ulaş Ateşçi from Turkey. Comrade Ulaş is a leader of the Socialist Eşitlik Grubu, the Socialist Equality Group in Turkey. Founded by late Comrade Halil Çelik, Socialist Eşitlik is fighting to build a section of the ICFI in Turkey. This is of great political significance for the working class through the entire region. Because of its geographic position between Europe, Asia and the Middle East, Turkey is one of the centers of the NATO war drive. But it's also a center of the class struggle, which is taking ever more explosive forms. Comrade Ulaş and his comrades are playing a central role in the growing movement of the Turkish working class and have won a powerful hearing among teachers, healthcare workers and sections of the industrial working class. A warm welcome to Comrade Ulaş, who is addressing this meeting from Istanbul.
Merhaba. 4. Enternasyonel Uluslararası Komitesi ile siyasi dayanışma içinde olan Sosyalist Destek Grubu'ndan devrimci selamlar. Uluslararası İşçi Sınıfı 2022 1 Mayıs'ını ABD önderliğindeki NATO güçleriyle Rusya arasında Ukrayna topraklarına devam eden savaşın tüm insanlığı bir nükleer dünya savaşıyla tehdit ettiği koşullarda karşılıyor. Bu yakın tehlikeye COVID-19 pandemisi eşlik ediyor. Hükümetlerin kitlesel enfeksiyon ve ölüm politikası sonucu dünya çapında yaklaşık 20 milyon insan COVID-19'un hayatını kaybetti. Hastalığın yayılmasını durdurmak için neredeyse tüm önlemlerin kaldırıldığı Türkiye'de Cumhurbaşkanı Recep Tayyip Erdoğan hükümeti kapalı alanlarda maske takma zorunluluğunu da neredeyse tümüyle kaldırdı. Her yerde olduğu gibi egemen sınıfın kar çıkarlarının yön verdiği bu suç oluşturan politika sonucu Türkiye'deki resmi Covid-19 ölümleri sayısı 100.000'e yaklaşıyor. Bu politika burjuva muhalefet partilerinin, sendikaların ve sahte solun doğrudan ya da dolaylı desteğiyle uygulanıyor. Doğrusu Türkiye'de işçi sınıfını pandemiyi sona erdirmek ve ölümleri durdurmak üzere küresel bir sıfır Covid politikası uğruna mücadele etmeye çağıran tek siyasi elim Sosyalist Eşitlik Grubu'dur. Pandeminin sona erdiğine dair bilim dışı iddialara karşın bu ölümlerin 60.000'i son bir yılda meydana geldi. Sadece bu yıl yaklaşık 17.000 kişi bu önlenebilir hastalıktan dolayı hayatını kaybetti. Üstelik Türk Tabipleri Birliği Pandemi Çalışma Grubu üyesi Güçlü Yaman'ın hesaplamalarına göre pandemiden sonra meydana gelen toplam fazladan ölüm sayısı 281.000'i geçmiş durumda. Karadeniz bölgesinde bulunan ve hem Ukrayna hem de Rusya ile komşu olan Türkiye, coğrafi konumunun yanı sıra askeri stratejik ilişkileri bakımından da savaşın merkezinde yer alıyor. Bir NATO üyesi olarak Ukrayna'yı siyasi ve askeri olarak destekleyen Ankara, Rusya ile de önemli ekonomik ve askeri ilişkilere sahip. Rusya'ya karşı ABD önderliğinde artan saldırganlığa rağmen Ankara'nın bu konumu onu Kiev ile Moskova arasında arabuluculuk yapmaya yönlendirse de Türkiye nihayetinde NATO emperyalizminin bölgedeki bir ileri karakolu işlevi görmeye devam ediyor. Türk burjuvazisi çeşitli anlaşmazlıklarına karşın 1991'de Stalinistlerin Sovyetler Birliği'nin dağıtmasından sonra ABD emperyalizminin ve müttefiklerinin Balkanlarda, Orta Doğu'da ve Kuzey Afrika'da giriştiği müdahalelerin ve rejim değişikliği savaşlarının suç ortaklığını yapmıştır. Ukrayna Savaşı bu 30 yıllık emperyalist savaş yöneliminin ve NATO'nun doğuya doğru amansızca genişlemesinin bir ürünüdür. Bir ankete göre nüfusun yaklaşık %80'i Ukrayna'daki savaşa karşı ve Türkiye'nin savaşta tarafsız kalması gerektiğini söylüyor. Milyonlarca insanın ölümüne ve on milyonlarcasının sığınmacı haline gelmesine yol açan bu emperyalist yağma savaşları, Dünya Sosyalist web sitesi tarafından ayrıntılı bir şekilde belgelenen sayısız savaş suçuyla damgalanmıştır. Yugoslavya'dan Irak'a, Afganistan'dan Libya, Suriye ve Yemen'e kadar uzanan bu savaşlar, Türk devletinin doğrudan ya da dolaylı desteğini almıştır. Bu suçlara İsrail'in Filistin halkına karşı devam eden zulmünü de eklemek gerekir. İsrail ile ilişkilerinin seyrine göre bu zulmü zaman zaman ikiyüzlü bir şekilde kınayan Ankara, içeride Kürt halkına ve seçilmiş politikacılara yönelik antidemokratik baskıyı sürdürmektedir. Rusya'nın ABD-NATO emperyalizminin ekmeğine yağ süren, Rus ve Ukrayna işçi sınıfını bölmeye hizmet eden gerici istilasını kınayan Erdoğan hükümeti, Suriye'ye ve Irak'a yasa dışı askeri harekatlar düzenliyor ve bu ülkelerde kalıcı askeri birlikler bulunduruyor. Bu politika NATO yanlısı Türk burjuva muhalefet partilerinin desteğiyle uygulanıyor. Türkiye'nin Irak Kürdistan bölgesel yönetimi topraklarındaki Kürdistan İşçi Partisi güçlerine karşı Nisan ayı ortasında başlattığı son askeri harekatın temel olarak iki amacı bulunuyor. Birincisi, Avrupa'nın Rusya'ya enerji bağımlılığını sona erdirmeye yönelik ABD destekli planların parçası olarak Irak doğalgazının Türkiye üzerinden Avrupa'ya taşınmasının önünün açılması. İkincisi ise içeride kontrol edilemez hale gelen sınıfsal gerilimleri bastırmak ve dışarıya yönlendirmek için savaşın kullanılması. Sosyalist Eşitlik Grubu, Türkiye'de dahil olmak üzere tüm NATO güçlerinin Afrika, Orta Doğu ve Orta Asya'daki birliklerinin geri çekilmesini savunmaktadır. İçeride Kürt halkının temel demokratik hakları tanınmalı, siyasi tutuklular serbest bırakılmalıdır. Küresel bir olgu olan gıda ve yakıt fiyatlarındaki enflasyon, daha Ukrayna'daki savaşın ve Rusya'ya yönelik yaptırımların başlamasından önce Türkiye'de rekor seviyelere ulaşmıştı. Pandeminin tedarik zincirlerinde yarattığı aksamayla beraber 10 yıllardır mali sermaye yararına izlenen ekonomi politikalarının sonucu olan bu durum, milyonlarca işçi ailesinin yaşam koşullarını katlanılmaz hale getirdi. Aynı dönemde hükümet, işçi sınıfından kapitalist egemen sınıfa doğru görülmemiş bir servet aktarılması sürecini yönetti. Mart ayında yıllık resmi enflasyon %61'e ulaşırken, Bağımsız Enflasyon Araştırma Grubu'nun çok daha güvenilir raporuna göre gerçek enflasyon oranı %142'ye yükselmiş durumda. Türkiye, buğday ithalatının yaklaşık %80'ini Ukrayna ve Rusya'dan yaparken, savaş ve yaptırımlar Türkiye'yi küresel gıda krizinin merkez üslerinden biri haline getirdi. Kuzey Afrika ve Orta Doğu bölgesi gıda ve yakıt krizinden en sert etkilenen yer olurken, Sudan'dan Kenya'ya, İran'dan Yunanistan'a kitlesel protestolara ve grevlere tanık olunuyor. Doğrusu bu yılın Ocak ve Şubat ayında Türkiye'yi saran fiili grev dalgası, gelişmekte olan Uluslararası İşçi Sınıfı Hareketi'nin habercilerinden biriydi. Emek Çalışmaları Topluluğu'nun derlediği verilere göre 2022'nin sadece ilk 2 ayında en az 106 fiili grev meydana geldi. Önceki 5 yıldaki yıllık ortalama fiili grev sayısının 97 olması, yoğunlaşan ve militanlaşan bir işçi sınıfı hareketine işaret ediyor. Sağlık emekçileri geçtiğimiz aylarda ülke çapında bir dizi grev düzenlerken, doktorlar Mayıs ayında 6 gün greve gitmeye hazırlanıyor. En önemlisi de bu işçi sınıfı hareketi dünya çapında olduğu gibi büyük ölçüde sendikalardan bağımsız ve onlara meydan okuyarak gelişiyor. Fisk örneğinde olduğu gibi bazıları doğrudan sahte sol güçlerin kontrolünde olan sendikalar, işçi sınıfının gelişen hareketini boğmak için egemen sınıf ile sıkı işbirliği içinde çalışıyor. Sosyalist Eşitlik Grubu bunlara karşı taban komitelerin Uluslararası İşçi İttifakı'nın parçası olarak sendikalardan bağımsız taban komiteleri oluşturulması çağrısı yapıyor. Burjuvazinin yükselen sınıf mücadelesini bastırmak ve işçi sınıfını bölmek için başvurduğu gerici araçlardan bir diğeri de sığınmacı karşılığıdır. Suriye başta olmak üzere bölgedeki emperyalist savaşlardan dolayı ülkelerini terk etmek zorunda kalan savunmasız sığınmacılar, giderek artan oranda tüm siyaset kurumunun hedefi haline geliyor. Sosyalist Eşitlik Grubu, sahte solun desteklediği burjuva muhalefet partilerinin de dile getirdiği sığınmacıları ülkelerine geri gönderme çağrılarını şiddetle reddediyor. Gerçek şu ki işçiler sığınmacıları savunmadan ve şöben milliyetçileri reddetmeden birleşemez ve burjuvaziyle mücadele edemezler. Sığınmacılar, Türkiye'de dahil istedikleri ülkede tam yurttaşlık haklarıyla yaşama ve çalışma olanağına sahip olmalıdır. Gezi Parkı davası sanıklarına verilen cezalar da nihayetinde işçi sınıfı içinde artan toplumsal muhalefete gözdağı vermeyi amaçlamaktadır. 2013'te toplumsal eşitsizliğe ve otoriter politikalara karşı ülke genelinde patlak veren ve milyonlarca insanın katıldığı Gezi Parkı protestoları Erdoğan hükümetini sarsmıştı. Erdoğan, 2020'de beraatla sonuçlanan davayı yeniden açtırdı ve geçtiğimiz salı günü sanıklara ağır cezalar verildi. Bugün sahte solda dahil olmak üzere tüm siyaset kurumu, işçi sınıfı içinde büyüyen öfkenin ve muhalefetin bir kitlesel devrimci hareket biçiminde patlak vermesini önlemeye çalışma konusunda birleşiyor. Büyük ölçüde itibarsızlaşan Erdoğan hükümeti savaş ve baskı politikalarıyla ayakta kalmaya çalışırken, burjuva muhalefet partileri büyüyen toplumsal muhalefeti yaklaşan seçimlere akıtmaya uğraşıyor. Sosyalist Eşitlik Grubu, emperyalizme göbekten bağlı Türk burjuvasının hizmetinde olan düzen partilerinin milyonlarca işçinin ve izleyen kitlelerin temel sorunlarını çözmekten yapısal olarak aciz olduğu konusunda ısrarcıdır. Ölümcül pandemi politikasına, emperyalist savaşa, diktatörlüğe ve toplumsal eşitsizliğe son verme mücadelesi, kapitalist sisteme ve burjuva egemenliğine karşı işçi iktidarı ve uluslararası sosyalizm uğruna mücadele etmek demektir. Tüm dinleyicilerimizi bu programı savunan tek siyasi eğilim olan 4. İnternasyonel Uluslararası Komitesi'nin ve ona bağlı sosyalist eşitlik partilerinin inşasına katılmaya çağırıyoruz. Teşekkürler.
Thank you, Comrade Ulaş. Underlying the explosive development of the class struggle is in a very fundamental sense the historical crisis of the capitalist system. There are few others who can speak as profoundly on this issue as Comrade Nick Beams. Comrade Nick is a long-standing leader of the ICFI and is recognized as the expert on Marxist economics. He writes on this extensively for the World Socialist website. Greetings, Comrade Nick from Australia.
Comrades and friends, this May Day is being held amid an historic breakdown of the world capitalist system, posing the necessity for the international working class to take power in its own hands to implement a socialist program if mankind is to avoid being plunged into a catastrophe. The deepening crisis is not some theoretical postulate. It dominates over and determines every aspect of the daily life of workers throughout the world. It has been accelerated and exacerbated by the needless mass deaths resulting from COVID-19, the result of the refusal of capitalist governments to take the necessary measures to eliminate it, and the drive to a new world war for the redivision of the world initiated by the US and NATO war against Russia in the Ukraine. These cataclysmic events have acted as catalysts for the eruption to the surface of fundamental contradictions of the global capitalist profit system that have been maturing over decades. Over the past 50 years, all the measures undertaken by the ruling classes in response to these contradictions have led inexorably to their intensification. After the bloody first half of the 20th century, the global capitalist system was restabilised after World War II, grounded on the economic power of US capitalism. But that economic supremacy was steadily undermined in the 1950s and 1960s, and in August 1971, the US unilaterally removed the gold backing from the US dollar. It ended the global financial system established at the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 that had formed the foundation of the post-war capitalist equilibrium. The scrapping of dollar gold convertibility was an attempt by the US to deal with its decline, reflected in its mounting balance of trade and current account deficits. The new financial system, based solely on a fiat currency, not backed by real value in the form of gold, led to new contradictions that manifested themselves in a surge of inflation. By the end of the 1970s, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, a fundamental law of the capitalist economy, had begun to assert itself, finding expression in so-called stagflation, the development of recession combined with rapid price hikes. This was the driving force for the restructuring of the world economy initiated in the 1980s under the Reagan and Thatcher governments, which resulted in the destruction of whole swathes of industry and the initiation of globalised production to take advantage of cheaper sources of labour. A key component of this process was the rise of financialisation, the accumulation of profit not through the expansion and development of industry, as had taken place during the post-war boom, but through speculation on the stock market and in other parts of the financial system. The growth of financial parasitism in the 1980s did not overcome the developing crisis of the profit system, but led to its eruption in a new form in the Wall Street crash of October 1987, still the biggest single-day plunge in history. A new policy was initiated. In response to the crash, the US Federal Reserve, under the chairmanship of Alan Greenspan, intervened to stabilise the market by providing financial support. This was not a one-off measure. It was the start of a new financial regime in which the Fed intervened in response to the collapse of one speculative bubble by providing the funds to finance the next one. These interventions continued amid the growing financial storms of the 1990s and early 2000s, each one more serious than the last, as all the regulations introduced in the 1930s to try and curb speculation were scrapped. In the wake of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the ruling classes around the world celebrated the triumph of the free market. A new period designated as the Great Moderation had begun, they claimed. The contradictions of the capitalist system had been overcome. Low inflation meant central banks could intervene in financial markets via the provision of money at low interest rates to keep the wheels of parasitic profit accumulation turning without financial problems arising. Furthermore, the wages of the working class were suppressed by the trade union apparatuses. All was for the best in the best of all possible worlds. But new contradictions were developing, and the financial system imploded in September 2008 with the collapse of the investment bank Lehman Brothers and the impending demise of the insurance giant AIG. The Fed massively increased its support for the financial oligarchy. It lowered interest rates to zero and initiated quantitative easing. It provided trillions of dollars to purchase financial assets as the US government bailed out major corporations to the tune of hundreds of billions. The QE policy was said to be temporary, to be ended as soon as normal conditions returned. That day never came. Even minor attempts to lift interest rates, such as took place in 2018, provoked a crisis on Wall Street, leading to their reversal. Consequently, when the pandemic struck at the beginning of 2020, it led to a market collapse potentially even more serious than that of 2008. The stock market plunged, and at one point in March, the $22 trillion US Treasury market, the foundation of the US and global financial system, froze. There were no buyers for US debt, supposedly the safest financial asset in the world. The collapse was provoked by the fear, in the face of walkouts by workers over health dangers, that public health measures would be adopted to eliminate the virus. This fear arose from the nature of finance capital itself. It appears to operate in another dimension, a kind of heaven, where money, by its very nature, simply begets more money. But all financial assets are, in the final analysis, a claim on the surplus value extracted from the working class in the process of capitalist production. Meaningful public health measures threatened this flow of wealth. Hence, the back to work drive, the insistence that the cure cannot be worse than the disease. Nothing, especially not the health, well-being and lives of workers, could be allowed to impede the flow of wealth to the financial oligarchy. As governments around the world provided billions for corporations, the US Fed and other major central banks poured an estimated $16 trillion into financial markets. The Fed doubled its assets holdings virtually overnight to more than $8 trillion, becoming the backstop for every financial market, spending at one point $1 million every second. The consequences are writ large. The Oxfam Aid Agency has reported that during the first 2 years of the pandemic, the incomes of the bottom 99% of society fell, while the wealth of the 10 richest individuals doubled. A new billionaire has been created every 26 hours since the pandemic began, and the wealth of the world's 2,775 billionaires increased during the 2 years of COVID by more than in the whole of the previous 14, which were themselves a bonanza. Two key questions now arise. What comes next, and what is to be done? Our perspective must first of all be grounded on the lessons of the past 50 years, that every measure adopted by the ruling classes to combat a crisis only creates the conditions for its re-emergence in an even more explosive form. That is the case today. The refusal of governments to take action to eliminate the pandemic as they protect the financial markets, coupled with the actions of the central banks, has created a crisis in the real economy, major disruptions to supply chains and rampant inflation. It has been exacerbated by the US war drive aimed at opening Russia and then China for plunder as it seeks to overcome its historic decline by pumping fresh blood into its sclerotic arteries. And now the class struggle, so long suppressed, is intervening. Central banks led by the Fed are lifting interest rates with the aim of inducing a recession to combat workers as they are driven into struggle by the daily cuts in living standards from inflation. Massive government debts built up through corporate bailouts must be repaid by slashing social spending. The interest rate hikes, imposed under conditions of rising inflation, now threaten to set off a new financial crisis. This is because the speculation that has been so central to profit accumulation for decades has been totally dependent on a low interest rate regime. Commodity markets are already in turmoil, along with bond markets, and stock markets gyrate amid fears that the collapse of even a relatively small financial institution can spark a systemic crisis. There is, however, no final crisis of capitalism. There is no crisis which in and of itself will be fatal to the profit system. The social order of devastation and destruction can only be ended by the conscious revolutionary struggle of the working class to overthrow it. That requires the building of the International Committee of the Fourth International as the World Party of Socialist Revolution to lead this battle. That is the urgent task arising from the deepening economic breakdown on this May Day.
Thank you, Comrade Nick. As in the period of the two world wars in the 20th century, the historical breakdown of the capitalist system is radicalizing a whole generation of young workers and students. Comrade Gregor Link is a leading member of the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, the youth movement of the ICFI. Gregor writes regularly for the World Socialist website and will speak to us from Berlin.
In front of the eyes of millions and billions of young people around the world, capitalism has been exposed for what it is: a hostile and bankrupt, historically obsolete system that serves only to enrich a tiny capitalist class in every country, even as the lives of hundreds of millions are threatened by a deadly virus and the spectre of nuclear war. What has been the experience of us young workers throughout the world? NATO's proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, which is rapidly raising the threat of World War III, is the latest in a period of more than 30 years of unending war. The campaign of US imperialism to offset its economic decline has destroyed entire societies. Young people of entire world regions, such as the Middle East and large parts of Africa, have known nothing but imperialist war and murderous conflict. The COVID-19 pandemic has fundamentally affected youth in every single country. Millions have lost parents, grandparents, and co-workers. The decision of the world's governments to let the virus rip through society has produced this pandemic. To maintain the enrichment of the capitalist oligarchs, they consciously refused to eliminate the virus and end the pandemic. Almost 2 decades of perpetual economic crisis have left hundreds of millions of youth unemployed, while housing prices and soaring inflation make it all but impossible to raise a family. The majority of working class youth are being exploited by the so-called gig economy, and hardly anybody gets a job that provides a secure future. Driven by these irreconcilable class interests, governments all over the world viciously attack democratic and social rights that have been won by previous generations of workers. Trying to suppress opposition and foment national division, the ruling classes resort to censorship, propaganda, and far-right violence. Along with the threat of nuclear world war, the fascist danger has never been greater. But ours is a generation grown up to be intimately interconnected with each other. This global interconnectivity has undermined the efforts of the ruling class to sow division among working class youth. And it has profoundly revolutionary implications. As we enter in the monumental class battles that lie ahead, our ability to communicate and coordinate these struggles on a global scale will prove to be a decisive factor. It has become clear that capitalism has nothing to offer to youth but poverty, sickness, climate change, and World War. More than ever before, this year's May Day raises the necessity to abolish this system and replace it with socialism on a world scale. A global society must be built that places lives before profit and uses all of society's resources to serve the social needs of the world working class and all of humanity. I appeal to all of you to take part in this struggle. Turn to the working class. The fight against capitalism is not a generational issue, nor is it a question of individual identity. The working class consists of all ethnicities, genders, and orientations, and is objectively unified by the same class interests. Build the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, who fight to connect young people to the historical experiences of the working class. Study the lessons of history and the perspectives of the ICFI. Make this extraordinary May Day a milestone in your development as a Marxist and Trotskyist and a revolutionary fighter for socialism.
Thank you, Gregor. We are now turning back to Australia, where our comrades are currently waging a powerful election campaign. It is the only campaign advancing an independent socialist program for the working class, against the pandemic, against war, and for social equality and the defense of democratic rights. Comrade Cheryl Crisp, who will now speak to us from Sydney, is the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party in Australia. Please welcome Comrade Cheryl.
On behalf of the SEP Australia, I would like to welcome you all to the 2022 International May Day online rally. Much has changed since we last celebrated the International Day of the Working Class a year ago. The unrestrained spread of COVID-19 in every single country, with the exception of China, has condemned almost 20 million people to an unnecessary death. A virus which science, medicine, and public experts knew how to eliminate has been unleashed onto the world's population, prioritising production, profit, and wealth. The war in Ukraine, the result of long-held plans of US imperialism to dismember and destroy Russia, threatens the globe with World War III and nuclear war. This proxy war of NATO-US against Russia is using Ukraine as its staging ground and its people as cannon fodder. For the working class internationally, it is faced with spiralling inflation, resulting in rising prices, food shortages, hunger, and starvation. The outcome of both the pandemic and the war. The situation in Australia, despite the constant mantra of exceptionalism and the lucky country, has transformed. As is the case for most, the lives of people here are unrecognisable to just 2 years ago. This time last year, Australia had recorded less than 30,000 infections. Today, it is almost 6 million, with 96% of those cases occurring in the last 5 months. The death toll in May 2021 was 910. Today, it is 7,142. 72% taking place since December the 1st, 2021. The country is in the middle of an election campaign where a conspiracy exists between the coalition government of Scott Morrison and the Labor Party opposition that COVID will not be mentioned. Despite growing infection rates, hospitalisation and death, the narrative is the pandemic is over. The reason for this disaster is all the measures begrudgingly implemented by the government in March 2020, which had kept infections and deaths relatively low, have now been scrapped. Everything. No lockdowns, testing, isolating, contact tracing, and social distancing. Along with it is any reporting of the pandemic. In its place is a frenzied war fever aimed at preparing the population for military confrontation with China. The entire political elite, with the coalition and Labor in the lead, are outbidding each other in their frothing anti-China denunciations to prove who will best serve US imperialism and prosecute provocations against China. Unbelievably, the United States, while inciting the war against Russia, which threatens catastrophe in Europe and more broadly, is simultaneously ramping up the drive to war against China. The hysterical response by Australian politicians and the Biden administration to the signing of a security pact a week ago between China and the tiny nation of the Solomon Islands, with a population less than 700,000 and thousands of kilometres from both Australia and the US, is because it is seen as a threat to the long-term hegemony of the US in the Pacific, which it refers to as an American lake. Australian Government Defence Minister Dutton declared on Anzac Day, the day the Australian ruling class celebrates the slaughter of World War I, that, quote, the way to preserve peace was to prepare for war, close quote. Prime Minister Morrison threatens that if the Chinese establishes a military presence in the Solomons, which he describes as on Australia's doorstep, it would constitute a red line being crossed, a not too veiled threat at military intervention. But it has been the Labor Party which has greeted the agreement with the most bellicose and almost unhinged denunciations. Labor Shadow Foreign Minister Penny Wong described the failure of the government to prevent the signing of the agreement as the, quote, worst foreign policy blunder in the Pacific since the end of World War II, close quote. Labor has aligned itself with the US response, which saw Kurt Campbell, the White House Indo-Pacific coordinator, dispatched to Honiara, who threatened like a mafia don that, quote, if steps are taken to establish a de facto permanent Chinese military presence, power projection capabilities, or a military installation, the United States would then have significant concerns and respond accordingly, close quote. There is more than a whiff that military action and a regime change operation is being considered. The breathtaking hypocrisy is for all to see. Ukraine has been supplied with unlimited lethal weaponry, military training and funding to purportedly preserve its right to join NATO. But when the Solomons exercises its right to sign a pact with China, it is threatened by the most powerful military nation on earth, backed by its deputy sheriff in the Pacific, the Australian government, and the Labor Party. The SEP makes central to its election campaign the fight for the unity of the Chinese and Australian working classes in the common struggle against capitalism, the source of war. In fact, the only war which should be waged is the one against COVID. But the ruling elite in every country has surrendered that fight, with ordinary people, the poor and the working class paying the price. As is the case internationally, it is the working class in this country who are most affected by the virus. 36% of all COVID-19 deaths occurred in the 20% most disadvantaged areas. Only 9.8% were in the most advantaged quintile. Immigrants to Australia have died from COVID-19 at more than 2.5 times the rate of those born here, with people born in the Middle East dying at almost 9 times the overall rate. Deaths from long COVID are increasing at an alarming rate. The pandemic and now the war in Ukraine has fueled a massive increase in the cost of living due to fuel and food price rises. Inflation in Australia in the last quarter has jumped to 5.1%, the largest increase for almost 3 decades, not counting the goods and services tax imposed in 2000. This makes it higher than that following the global financial crisis of 2008. For non-discretionary goods, it is almost 7%. Wages, however, have stagnated for almost a decade. The right to a roof over one's head is in the past. Almost 10% of the poorest electorates in the country have up to 76% mortgage stress, and that is before the slated interest rate rise, which could occur as early as next week. Of 46,000 rental properties available nationwide, only 32 are affordable for somebody on unemployment benefits. It is these intolerable conditions that are driving workers into struggle and fight. Nurses, paramedics, healthcare workers, and now teachers are taking strike action against the crippling workloads and substandard pay to which they are paid. A rebellion is developing against the government and the unions who enforce its demands. The resolution of this mounting disaster cannot be through pressuring parties, governments, or unions, but through the formation of independent rank-and-file committees in factories, schools, hospitals, and neighbourhoods, which can provide the leadership and socialist perspective needed to conduct these struggles. In conclusion, on this May Day, we particularly emphasise the international unity of the working class. We especially reach out to the Chinese working class, the largest on earth. The enemy of workers here and internationally is not the Chinese masses, but the capitalist class. It is in unity with all sections of the working class for a socialist future that we must organise and fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Cheryl. Our second to last speaker today is Comrade Tom Peters. He is a leading member of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand, which is fighting to build a section of the ICFI. Comrade Tom is writing extensively on the development of the class struggle and the pandemic in New Zealand and the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific. The region is at the center of the US war drive against China. Comrade Tom.
On behalf of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand, I want to extend our revolutionary greetings to everyone joining this online May Day rally, including viewers from throughout the South Pacific. The Pacific region is caught in the middle of an unprecedented military build-up by US imperialism and its allies, including Australia and New Zealand, aimed against China. Workers across the impoverished region also confront soaring social inequality, environmental disasters, and a mounting death toll from the pandemic. In Tonga, a volcanic eruption and tsunami in January wiped out entire villages, forced the evacuation of whole islands, destroyed food crops, crippling the country's economy, and this disaster is now compounded by COVID-19, which was most likely introduced to Tonga by one of the military vessels sent to deliver aid from Australia or another country in the region. So far, at least 11 people have died. Samoa, Vanuatu and Kiribati have also recorded their first COVID-19 deaths this year after previously being isolated from the pandemic. Last year, when COVID ripped through Papua New Guinea, Fiji and French Polynesia, hospitals were overwhelmed and morgues were filled to capacity. Thousands more lives are now at risk in countries with very little healthcare infrastructure, low vaccination rates, and widespread poverty-related illnesses such as diabetes. Responsibility for these preventable deaths rests primarily with the imperialist countries, including Australia and New Zealand, which regard the Pacific as their own colonial backyard. While Canberra and Wellington denounce Chinese influence in the region as a threat that has to be countered by huge increases in military spending, the same governments have dropped any pretense of trying to stop the spread of COVID-19. Only our movement, the International Committee of the Fourth International, is fighting for a fully funded, scientific, global elimination strategy. This is opposed by every capitalist government. Last October, the Labour Party Greens coalition government in New Zealand abandoned its zero COVID policy, which had saved thousands of lives in the first 2 years of the pandemic. The decision shocked people throughout the world who saw New Zealand as proof that elimination was achievable. The about-face by Jacinda Ardern's government was made at the insistence of big business, which views lockdowns and all public health measures as an intolerable barrier to profit-making. It was also a completely anti-democratic decision. Workers who strongly supported elimination were never asked if they wanted to ditch the policy and adopt one instead of mass infection. All of the claims used to justify the let-it-rip agenda, including that Omicron is mild, that vaccination alone will enable people to live with the virus, all of this has been exposed as lies. In just 4 months, nearly 1 in 5 New Zealanders, 900,000 people, have been infected. That's according to official figures. The real figure is undoubtedly much higher. New Zealand's death toll has shot up from 59 people at the end of last year to more than 700 deaths as of last week. In the last fortnight, those deaths included a child aged under 9 and a person aged under 19. The public health system has been overwhelmed, with many essential operations cancelled. Hospitals in Northland, the poorest region, recently asked patients' families to assist with basic tasks normally performed by healthcare workers. One nurse described the situation in New Zealand to us as soul-destroying. There is rising anger in the working class over the spread of COVID, as well as the unprecedented increase in social inequality. The Ardern government has used the pandemic to give tens of billions of dollars to big business in the form of subsidies and bailouts. According to one calculation made last December, the value of shares, bonds, and other non-bank financial assets increased by 36%, $257 billion, over 2 years. Meanwhile, the working class is suffering from soaring inflation, which has increased by 6.9% annually, the highest increase in 30 years. Rents have risen by more than 25% over the last 4 years, leading to increased homelessness and overcrowding. Nearly 1 in 4 children now lives in poverty, and this is certain to increase further. As workers seek to fight back, they are coming into conflict with the trade unions, which have worked with the state apparatus to enforce the unsafe reopening of schools and businesses, and austerity measures, including a public sector pay freeze. Nurses, who held a nationwide strike last year to demand safe levels of staffing and decent wages, have reacted angrily to a so-called pay equity deal between the government and the New Zealand Nurses Organisation, which completely fails to address the crisis in hospitals. 2 months ago, the Employment Court banned another strike that was planned by 10,000 healthcare workers in several different occupations, an extraordinary ruling which points to the anti-democratic methods that will increasingly be used against the working class. The Public Service Association immediately capitulated to the court, calling off the strike. The experience of the pandemic highlights the need for workers to take matters into their own hands, to build new organisations to fight for the elimination of COVID-19 and for decent wages and conditions. Rank-and-file workplace committees must be established independent of the trade unions, which are integrated into the capitalist setup. The same task is posed by the escalating danger of world war. The Labour government has dragged New Zealand into the war against Russia in order to secure US support for New Zealand's own neo-colonial interests in the Pacific. This month, the government sent more than 50 military personnel and an Air Force supply plane to Europe, along with millions of dollars to buy weapons for the US NATO proxy forces in Ukraine. As in every country, the drumbeat for war against Russia and China is intended to divert rising anger over the pandemic and the social crisis at home onto an external enemy. The Socialist Equality Group stands alone in seeking to mobilise the working class in opposition to the war drive, which is backed by the unions and by Labour's middle-class nationalist and pseudo-left allies. The fight against war requires a socialist perspective aimed at uniting workers across the world in opposition to every form of nationalism and xenophobia. It is inseparable from the fight to put an end to capitalism, which is the source of inequality and the pandemic. I urge everyone listening from New Zealand to contact the Socialist Equality Group and to join the fight to build the New Zealand section of the ICFI, the World Party of Socialist Revolution. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tom. Our final speaker today is Comrade Joseph Kishore. Comrade Kishore is the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party in the US. In the center of world imperialism, the crisis of capitalism is particularly advanced. On the one hand, there's the ruling class turning to militarism, dictatorship and fascism. On the other, there are the growing struggles of the working class, which are the basis for defeating these evils. The conditions in the US, as internationally, are ripe for socialism. The SEP has stressed repeatedly that a major factor underlying the explosion of US imperialism is the intractable economic, social and political crisis in the United States itself. Comrade Kishore and the SEP are waging a powerful struggle to transform the explosive opposition in the American working class into a conscious movement for socialist revolution. Welcome, Comrade Kishore.
This May Day rally is being held as the war policy of the US and NATO against Russia has brought the world to the very brink of catastrophe. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union more than 3 decades ago, American imperialism has been in a state of continuous and expanding war, targeting one country after the next with invasion, occupation, and destruction. The eyes of Washington are now fixed on Russia and China, the principal geostrategic barriers to its dominance. Regional war is developing into world war, and the danger for all of mankind is enormous. Any assessment of the world situation, of the possibilities inherent in the trajectory of events, however, is incorrect if it leaves out what is the most powerful social force within the United States. What has always distinguished the Trotskyist movement is not only its understanding of the central role of American imperialism, but of the enormous social and political power that is the American working class. We say to workers throughout the world, there are 2 Americas. There is the America of Wall Street, the Pentagon, the CIA, the plutocracy, which lies, threatens, and bullies. But there is also the America of the working class. Indeed, nothing so clearly exposes the reality of class rule and the class divide in the United States than the response to the pandemic. The ruling elite, with absolute indifference to human life, refused to adopt the necessary public health measures to stop the pandemic. After bailing out Wall Street, they sent Americans back to work. More than 1 million people died, and the rich got richer. The life expectancy of Americans fell by nearly 2 years, and the stock market soared. Portfolios and gravestones to Americas. No major capitalist country is so unequal as the United States. In the course of its present conflict with Russia, the American ruling class has begun to speak of the wealth of the Russian oligarchs. We're going to seize their yachts, their luxury homes, and other ill-begotten gains, Joe Biden declared on Thursday. The ruling class is playing with fire. There is no wealth that is more ill-begotten than the wealth of the American oligarchy. Over the past 2 years of mass death, the wealth of U.S. billionaires grew by more than 70% to more than $5 trillion. $5 trillion. Fueled by the money printing operations of the Federal Reserve, pay for U.S. CEOs is now averages $14.2 million a year. Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, with $250 billion to his name, received $23 billion for a bonus last week. He broke the law to force open Tesla plants during the pandemic, and now he is buying Twitter for $43 billion. Just over 100 years ago, in 1919, the American socialist leader Eugene Debs gave a May Day speech heavily influenced by the October Revolution of 1917. "I am going to speak to you as a socialist, as a revolutionist, as a Bolshevist," Debs declared. "What is this thing that the whole world is talking about? What is it that the ruling class power is denouncing, upon which they are pouring a flood of malicious lies? It is the rise of workers, who for the first time in history are saying unitedly, 'We have made what there is. We produce wealth. Now we will take what we have produced, for it is ours.' Workers throughout the world will once again take up this call." For nearly half a century, the American ruling class waged a one-sided class warfare. The trade unions turned themselves into a labor police force, on the take from management, run by well-heeled executives who profit off the exploitation of those they claim to represent. The working class in the United States, however, has already begun to fight back. Over the past 2 years, a series of strikes and struggles of workers has erupted in many different industries. Volvo Trucks in Virginia, Kellogg's, John Deere, Dana, King Soopers grocery store workers. These battles were waged not just against management, but against the dictates of the trade unions as well. Auto workers launched wildcat actions against the efforts to keep plants open at the beginning of the pandemic. Educators walked out and protested the unsafe reopening of schools. Among nurses and other healthcare workers, the impact of the pandemic has fueled a mood of militancy and opposition that extends far beyond the ongoing strike of 5,000 nurses at Stanford in California. As with workers throughout the world, workers in the United States have been slammed by the surge in the costs of basic goods, including food and gas, accelerated by the economic impact of the US-NATO war against Russia. As a result of record inflation, workers are confronting a decline in real wages of between 10 and 15% in just 1 year. According to a Harris poll conducted 1 week ago, 60% of American workers said the economy is weak, and nearly half report that their own financial situation is getting worse. Only a third of respondents said the country is on the right track, compared to 60 who said it was on the wrong track. The top 2 fears for American voters are, according to the poll, inflation and the use of nuclear weapons. There is in the American working class a deep hostility and anger towards the entire political establishment. It is this that explains the mind-numbing propaganda that comes from the official media, the inability of political officials to speak a single truthful word. As Trotsky once noted, the American ruling class is the most fearful in the world. American capitalism is rotten to the core. Just 1 year ago, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, launched a fascistic coup to overturn the Constitution. The former president cannot deliver a speech without furious denunciations of the danger of socialism. Earlier this year, Biden himself declared that he was unsure whether the institutions of American democracy would survive another decade. In the campaign against Russia, however, the American President Biden joins hands with the co-conspirators of Trump and proclaims national unity on the basis of war. But the United States is not united. It is deeply divided, not along the lines of race and gender, the false divisions that the Democratic Party does everything it can foster, but along the lines of class. The American working class has a long and proud tradition of struggle. Today we celebrate May Day, the day of international working class solidarity. Indeed, the origins of May Day lie in the struggle of Americans for the 8-hour day, in the bloody suppression of workers in Chicago and the Haymarket Massacre of May 1886 and the subsequent frame-up. The history of the United States in the 20th century has been a history of militant class struggle. The ability of the American ruling class to thwart the development of a revolutionary movement in the United States was bound up in the final analysis with the strength of American capitalism. This objective factor, however, belongs to the long-distant past. In the Socialist Equality Party's program, adopted in 2010, we stated that, quote, "The change in objective conditions will lead American workers to change their minds. The reality of capitalism will provide workers with many reasons to fight for a fundamental and revolutionary change in the economic reorganization of society." This prognosis has become a reality. The question that confronts workers is, upon what basis and with what strategy must their struggles be developed? The growth of the class struggle requires the formation of organizations comprised and controlled by the workers themselves, independent of the corporatist trade unions. The Socialist Equality Party has taken the initiative for the formation of rank-and-file committees as part of the International Workers' Alliance of rank-and-file committees. These committees have played a leading role in many of the important struggles of the past 2 years. They must be expanded and developed into every industry and every section of the working class. The expansion of the class struggle and the independent organization of workers must be connected to the building of a socialist leadership in the working class. This means a fight against all the institutions and representatives of the ruling elite, from the fascistic nationalism of Trump to the reactionary racial and gender politics of the Democratic Party and the pro-imperialist pseudo-left. It means forging the strongest bonds between the workers in the United States and workers throughout the world. American workers are connected through the process of production and through revolutionary advances in communication with their class brothers and sisters in every country, like never before. There is no national solution to any of the great problems confronting mankind. The global pandemic, surging inflation that is impoverishing hundreds of millions, global warming, and now world war. And it means the development of a movement consciously directed at capitalism. The ruling class has forfeited its right to rule and has demonstrated the bankruptcy of the profit system upon which it rests. The basic problem confronting workers in the US and in every country is the problem of revolutionary leadership. The objective conditions enormously intensified by the pandemic create the possibility for socialist revolution. But the transformation of this objective possibility into political reality requires the building of a socialist leadership in the working class. And it depends on the actions of individuals to make the decision to build this leadership. The political leadership is the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Trotskyist Movement. There is no one else. The fundamental task that follows from this May Day rally is the building of the Fourth International, its national sections, the Socialist Equality Party, and the development of a revolutionary socialist movement against capitalism.
Thank you, Comrade Kishore, for this powerful contribution again stressing the central question of constructing a revolutionary leadership in the working class. This is the crucial task before us. We have heard today speakers from throughout the world elaborating a unified international perspective to fight against imperialist war, put an end to the pandemic, stop exploitation, and create a society based on social equality. I want to conclude by calling on all of you listening today to become active and join the struggle for socialism. There's really no alternative and no time to lose. The capitalist warmongers have made clear that they're ready to plunge the earth into the abyss. The working class is making clear that it is ready to prevent this and it is fighting back. The fate of humanity will be determined in struggle, and this struggle has to be waged now. Build the International Workers' Alliance of Rank and File Committees. Join the International Committee of the Fourth International and its national sections. Take up the fight for socialism.